Hi, everybody. Tonight, I invite you to drift with me into the dusky corridors of centuries long past, where kings wore crowns heavy not only with gold, but with dread and ruin. This is the tale of some of the most terrible kings in medieval history, men whose greed, cruelty, and folly shaped the fate of kingdoms and left whispers that linger still in ancient stone halls. We shall wander slowly through candlelit chambers and moonlit battlements, feeling the chill of secrets long buried beneath moss and time. So let us begin our journey with the first king, whose name, once spoken with fear, now lies forgotten on brittle parchment and the trembling lips of old ghosts. In a northern realm wrapped in mist and icy winds, there once reigned a monarch named Aldrich the Cruel. His castle, perched upon a jagged cliff above the gray sea, was a fortress of black granite and iron gates that never knew warmth. The peasants who toiled in his lands rarely glimpsed him, for he hid behind thick walls and thicker lies, sending out knights clad in mail and black surcoats to collect his taxes in blood as much as in coin. They said Aldrich had once been a boy with eyes like the spring sky, clear and full of mischief, but that brightness had long been snuffed out when his father, King Thurston, met a violent end upon the very steps of the throne room. On that storm-raked night, Aldrich, barely 17, watched as his father's life drained away under the assassin's blade. Some whisper that Aldrich himself paid the cutthroat's fee, for though he wept for his father before the court, his hands trembled not from grief, but from the thrill of power so suddenly seized. Aldrich's first decree was to triple the levy upon his people. Grain, salt, fish, whatever the peasants dredged from river or field or sea, he claimed as his own. Those who fell behind found their doors splintered at dawn by men with pikes and hungry dogs. Many fled into the forests, choosing the mercy of wolves over the mercy of their king. Yet for every family who vanished, another arrived. Strangers from distant fens and islands, drawn by the king's promise of coin for mercenary service. His court soon brimmed with swords for hire and spies, men with no kin to betray them, nor conscience to restrain them. Within the walls of the cliffside castle, Aldrich feasted while his people starved. The hearths of the great hall roared with fire even in summer, blazing upon tables piled with venison and sweetmeats and barrels of rich wine. The king's laughter echoed off stone, mingling with the soft weeping of servants forced to pour him drink after drink, their hands raw and chapped from cold. He wore cloaks of crimson and midnight blue, heavy with fox fur and silver clasps. He wore a crown of wrought iron, studded with shards of amber that caught the candlelight like trapped embers. But all kings, no matter how cruel, fear something, some shadow under the bed, some truth that drifts through the corridors when the torches flicker low. For Aldrich, it was the memory of his father's last look, a look that, rumor claimed, followed him in every mirrored surface. His nights grew restless. Servants said he roamed the halls barefoot, muttering to portraits that lined the gallery. Sometimes they heard him speak softly to the empty throne as though it answered him back. One bitter winter, a wandering monk named Brother Hagen arrived at the gates of Aldrich's stronghold. Clad in threadbare robes and sandals wrapped in rags, Hagen asked for shelter in the name of the old saints. The guards, half frozen in their mail, laughed and let him pass, for the king was fond of jesters and fools. In the hall, before the crackling hearth, Brother Hagen knelt and told Aldrich's court tales of mercy and forgiveness, of kings who ruled with a gentle hand and were loved long after their bones turned to dust. Aldrich listened, wine sloshing in his jeweled goblet, eyes dark as the sea outside. When the monk finished, the king asked softly if such stories brought comfort on cold nights. Brother Hagen, lifting his weary head, said they did. Aldrich smiled, a thin, cruel smile, and ordered the monk's tongue cut out so that he might speak no more. The tongue was nailed to the castle gate as a warning to any who dreamed of mercy within Aldrich's realm. Yet tales and prayers are stubborn things. Word of the tongueless monk spread far beyond the cliff, carried on the salt winds to distant villages and border keeps. In secret, mothers told their children of Brother Hagen's courage and of Aldrich's monstrous deed. In dark barns and behind shuttered windows, farmers sharpened old scythes and spoke in hushed voices of rebellion. But inside the black fortress, Aldrich heard none of it. He dreamed only of his father's dying eyes and the knife that slipped so easily between the ribs. And in that dream every night, He was not the boy who watched, but the man who knelt at the blade's point. When spring returned, the snows melted from the cliff paths and the sea broke free of its icy chains. Fishermen, lean and silent, pushed their boats out once more, casting nets beneath a pale dawn sky. But they did not pay the king's tax that year. The roads to the castle were watched by figures in the trees, hunters with bows and cloaks the color of dusk. Couriers vanished. Coin coffers, once brimming, ran dry. The black granite walls began to feel less like protection and more like a tomb. Still, Aldrich the Cruel clung to his crown and his fear. He hosted feasts with dwindling supplies, drinking stale wine from goblets that smelled of rust. He sat on his iron throne, draped in furs that no longer kept out the chill, and whispered to portraits that did not answer. His knights, hungry and unpaid, drifted away one by one, fading into the forests they once scoured for fugitives. And so the peasants came at last, torches flickering like a swarm of fireflies beneath the cliff. They brought pitchforks and hatchets, their faces wrapped in scarves against the bitter sea wind. From the battlements, Aldrich watched them gather, a restless tide rising to sweep him away. He pressed a hand to his crown, feeling its iron teeth bite into his brow. For the first time in years, his eyes were clear, and they shone with something that looked almost like regret. The people did not storm the gates that night. They waited for dawn, for the sun to rise over the black stone and break the spell of fear. And when it did, they found the great hall empty, the iron throne cold, and the crown lying upon it like a discarded burden. Aldrich the Cruel was never seen again. Some say he flung himself into the sea's gray maw. Others claim he roams still barefoot on hidden forest paths, a ghost king whispering to the shadows. But in the villages below the cliffs, the people speak of him only when the nights grow long and the wind howls through the thatch, of the king who fed on fear until it devoured him whole. And they remember Brother Hagen, whose silent prayer lingers still, soft as the turning tide. In the hush that settled after Aldrich's fall, whispers of his ruin spread far beyond the frozen cliffs, drifting over rivers and forests to distant keeps where other kings sat uneasy upon their thrones. Word of a tyrant undone by his own cruelty was both a warning and a promise, a reminder that crowns, though forged of gold or iron, were lighter than the people who bore their weight upon bent backs. Far to the south, past tangled woodlands and rolling green hills, lay the sun-warmed realm of Marrowville, a land of vineyards and orchards, where summer lingered long, and the scent of ripening fruit drifted through open windows. It was a kingdom famed for its poetry, its painted chapels, its rose gardens sprawling behind high manor walls. Yet beneath its fragrant boughs ruled a king whose name was spoken in tones of dread, King Renard the Thorned. Renard's court was a garden in truth and in poison. His palace rose from a hill of marble and pale stone, crowned by terraces where climbing roses curled around columns and trellises. From afar, the palace glowed white in the afternoon sun, like a vision from some sweet dream. Up close, the roses revealed their secret. They bled scarlet drops where thorns bit into careless fingers, and their scent hid the rot that crept through the royal chambers at dusk. Renard had not always been terrible. He was once a young prince with a voice like honey, who composed verses for the court musicians and crowned his lovers with garlands of lilies and violets. His people adored him for his beauty, his laughter, his generous gifts at festival time. But as with many kings, sweetness soured under the crown's weight. It began with a famine, 2 summers of dry winds that cracked the fields and shriveled the vines. The peasants looked to Renard for relief, and he, in his silk-lined study, found his coffers emptier than the village granaries. To feed the people would mean to strip the court of its glittering excess, to humble the lords who feasted alongside him. Renard could not bear the thought. Instead, he summoned new taxes and demanded tribute in gold and land. His courtiers applauded his wisdom, for they too feared the hunger at the gates. When a band of farmers petitioned for mercy, carrying baskets of withered fruit as offering, Renard had them bound to the palace gates for 3 days and nights, so all might see what became of those who dared beg their king for pity. On the 4th dawn, they were gone, carried away to shallow graves beneath the rose gardens, where their bones fed the thorned roots that climbed the marble walls. The roses bloomed redder that year. Renar grew restless in their shadow, wandering the palace at dusk, plucking petals between manicured fingers. He began to distrust the poets who once sang his praises, fearing they would turn their verses against him. One by one, they vanished from the marble halls. Some fled to other courts, carrying secrets sewn into scraps of parchment. Others were found among the roses, their lips sealed with soil. It was said that Renar kept a secret garden hidden behind a locked gate, deeper still within the palace maze, a place where only he might wander among vines so heavy with blossoms they bent the iron trellises. There, rumor claimed, he whispered to the roses as if they might answer him back, confessing his fears to petals that would not betray him as men did. Yet thorns do not keep secrets for long. One autumn night, when the moon rose pale and watchful above Marivelle, a kitchen girl named Celeste slipped into the maze. She was small and fleet, with hair the color of spilled ink and eyes sharp as needles. Her mother had been among the farmers chained to the gate those years before, and Celeste had learned to move like a shadow through the palace that stole her kin. She found the hidden gate by candlelight, a rusted arch tangled in so many roses that the iron vanished beneath leaves and blooms. The lock yielded to her deft hands, and she stepped within, holding her breath against the heady sweetness that clung to the night air. There, under the moon's soft gaze, she saw Renar, barefoot in the dewy grass, clad in a robe of silver thread, his hands stained crimson where thorns had torn his skin. He spoke softly, as though pleading with the blossoms, asking them to guard him from betrayal, from famine, from the soft footfalls of death. He did not hear Celeste behind him. He did not see the small pruning knife she lifted from a gardener's abandoned basket. When at last he turned, the King of Roses found himself face to face with a girl who smelled of kitchen smoke and grief. No one knows what words passed between them in that hidden garden. Some say she forgave him as she pressed the blade to his throat, that her mercy was the last thing he tasted before the roses drank his blood. Others claim she whispered her mother's name again and again until his eyes dulled beneath the thorned canopy. Come morning, the palace awoke to find the hidden gate flung wide, and Renar the Thorned lying among his beloved flowers, pale and pierced by countless small wounds. The roses grew wilder that season, climbing higher than ever before, as if to hide what they had witnessed from the sun's bright eyes. Celeste vanished into the orchards and vineyards beyond Marivelle's marble walls. Some say she became a nun, others a ghost who tends rose bushes in secret gardens throughout the realm. But the people of Marivelle remember her when they pass beneath trellises heavy with blossoms, murmuring prayers that thorns never grow too close to crowns again. And in the hush that follows such tales, one can almost hear the roses sighing in the wind, echoes of secrets once whispered by a king, undone by his own bloom of cruelty, rooted deep in soil, watered by fear. South of Marivelle's sunlit vineyards and whispering orchards, beyond meadows where lavender bent and danced in the warm breeze, there sprawled a rugged land of highlands and misted lochs. Here, the wind carried the taste of heather and peat smoke, and the hills rolled on like great sleeping beasts beneath a sky forever shifting from silver to storm. In this wild country ruled King Eamon the Wolf, third in our tale of terrible kings, and perhaps the most feared among the clans, whose names still echo in the dark glens at twilight. Eamon's castle was not carved from marble, nor perched upon a gentle hill. It rose instead from a crag of black basalt, surrounded by ragged cliffs where seabirds wheeled and screamed at the restless waves far below. Its walls were thick and cold, built not for beauty, but for endurance against the gales that battered its ramparts every winter. Torches sputtered in the drafty corridors, and the scent of damp stone and old iron lingered long after the fires died each night. He was not born a wolf, they said. He was made one, shaped by blood feuds that swallowed his family when he was scarcely more than a boy. Clan against clan, kin against kin, blades drawn in rain and snow until the glens ran red and the earth drank its fill. Eamon was the last of his line when he claimed the high seat. He took the throne not with ceremony, but with a single blow. His father's brother, found drunk by the hearth, struck down with an axe. Eamon swung without a word. From that night on, the Highland clans bent knee out of terror rather than love. Eamon's banner, A silver wolf's head, snarling upon a field of midnight blue, flew above every keep and croft. To the people below, it was no longer a sign of protection, but a mark that they were hunted. For Eamon's justice, like the wolf he claimed as his spirit, was swift and merciless. His first decree forbade any clan from gathering in secret without his blessing. Weddings, wakes, harvest feasts, each required his seal, delivered by messengers clad in wolf pelts and armed with spears tipped in obsidian. Those who defied him found their gatherings broken by men on horseback, fires kicked into the mud, kegs split, fiddles smashed beneath boot and hoof. The old customs, which once wove the Highland folk together in song and story, began to wither like heather left untended in a cold wind. Yet Eamon was no mindless butcher. His cruelty was sharp as a hunter's trap, carefully set to catch both prey and rumor. He knew that fear alone would not bind the clans forever, so he offered favors, lands for loyalty, gold for silence, and titles for betrayal. A brother might be made laird if he turned against his kin, a neighbor spared if he whispered secrets by the hearth. In every village, trust became a thing as brittle as frost on a window pane, easily shattered by the knock of a stranger at the door. They called him the wolf, not only for his teeth, but for his eyes, gray and quick, always searching for the smallest twitch of disobedience. He rode out at dawn without escort, appearing at crofts and steadings unannounced. He would stand in the doorway, boots dripping with lock water, and ask after the well, the harvest, the children asleep in the loft. The folk would answer, trembling, never sure whether to offer him bread or brace for the blow that might follow. For sometimes he left gifts, a sack of meal, a pouch of silver coins. Other times he left with a son dragged off to serve in his warbands, or a father taken to the castle dungeons, carved deep into the basalt rock. In that chill darkness beneath the castle, men vanished like deer into a winter forest. The dungeons were said to be honeycombed tunnels, dripping with salt water from the cliffs. Those who entered rarely returned, but when they did, they stumbled out half mad, eyes wide, and voice hoarse from prayers that had gone unheard. Eamon, it was whispered, visited the cells himself when the mood struck him, his boots splashing in the shallow pools, the iron keys rattling like a pack of wolves in the dark. Yet, even a wolf can grow careless with age and triumph. Eamon's downfall began with a girl no older than he had been when he took his uncle's head. Her name was Brigdy, the daughter of a minor chieftain whose lands lay where the hills folded into the sea. Her clan, though small, was proud and fierce, known for binding their loyalties not with gold, but with ancient oaths spoken in groves of rowan and pine. When Eamon's men demanded tribute from Brigdy's father, a double tithe of cattle and grain, he refused. The wolf rode out himself to settle the matter. He found Breed waiting in the yard, her hair braided with red ribbons, her eyes steady as the winter lock. She offered him no wine, no seat by the hearth. She spoke her father's defiance plainly, voice carrying across the courtyard where clansfolk gathered in silence. Eamon, amused, only smiled. He asked her to come with him to the castle, to learn the ways of a queen beside a king who would one day tame all the Highlands. Breda laughed, though no one else dared. She told him a wolf might wear a crown, but it was still a beast that could be snared by those who knew the old paths through the forest. Eamon's smile faded. He turned his horse and left, but not without a promise. He would return by the next full moon, and the girl would kneel before him or watch her clans scatter like startled deer. When the moon rose full and white above the glens, Eamon returned with 50 riders. They found the chieftain's keep abandoned, the hearth cold, the cattle driven deep into the forests. Furious, Eamon set fire to the empty crofts, the flames painting the hills in flickering gold and red. But as the smoke rose, so too did a howl, not of wolves, but of horns calling clansmen to arms. Breedy had done what no laird nor knight had dared for 20 years. She bound the old oaths once more beneath the rowan trees, weaving the scattered folk into a single snare that no lone wolf could break. Eamon the wolf never fled. He met the clans in battle beneath a sky split by lightning and rain. They say he fought like the beast he was named for, his blade a silver flash in the storm. But for every blow he struck, 10 answered him, and when the dawn broke over the sodden moor, the wolf lay still among the heather, his crown lost somewhere in the mud, trampled under the boots of those who once feared to speak his name. Yet on misted nights in the highlands, when the wind howls through the passes and the rowan trees shiver beneath a hunter's moon, the old folk say you can still hear him. Eamon the wolf, padding unseen through the glens he once ruled with iron and fear, forever seeking a pack that turned against him in the end. Eastward from the highlands, where the wolf's howl still drifted on the mist, the land softened into broad plains and gentle rivers that shimmered like threads of silver under the sun. Here lay the kingdom of Aramor, famed for its fertile fields, its ancient abbeys, and the rolling green farmlands that fed half the realm. In the heart of Aramor stood a city girded by old stone walls and crowned with spires that pierced the sky like upturned spears. Within those walls ruled King Severin the Hollow, whose reign would stain Aramor's fair soil darker than any harvest ever could. Severin was a scholar before he was a king, the youngest son of a line that rarely troubled itself with swords or sieges. His father, King Edwin the Gentle, raised him not among knights but among inkpots and scrolls. In the vaulted libraries of Aramor, young Severin wandered among shelves so high they seemed to brush the heavens. He studied languages, the stars, the old philosophers whose dusty tomes whispered secrets of how men might be ruled without iron or fear. When plague carried off his elder brothers one cruel winter, Severin found himself heir to a throne he had never sought. At first, the people of Aramor rejoiced. Here was a learned king, a patron of monks and scribes, who spoke softly and promised peace. His coronation was a quiet affair. No feasting, no parades. Just a solemn vow spoken in the candlelit chapel where generations of kings lay buried beneath the marble floor. But a mind sharpened on books alone can cut deeper than any blade. Severin, perched in his tower high above the city, dreamed of a realm perfected, tidy, orderly, cleansed of all that he deemed impure or inefficient. His first decrees were small, almost reasonable. A new tax on merchants to fund the abbeys, a census to count every soul in Aramor's sprawling fields. Yet soon, the counting turned to sorting, and the sorting to culling. Severin's scribes, pale men with ink-stained fingers, spread through the villages like shadows. They carried ledgers bound in black leather, inscribed with the king's seal, a silver quill over an open book. They asked endless questions. How many children? How many bushels of grain? How much coin hidden in the eaves? How many prayers whispered at dawn? Those who lied found their names marked with red ink, and red ink led quickly to iron chains. In the beginning, few protested. After all, what was there to fear from parchment and wax seals? But when the winter crops failed one year, Severin's ledgers did not forgive. The grain owed to the crown was gathered nonetheless, taken from pantries and root cellars until families shivered in dark cottages, bellies empty, eyes hollow as the king's own. Rumors crept through Aramor, like cold draughts through broken shutters. They said Severin no longer slept in his bed, but in the library itself, surrounded by books piled so high that even candlelight could not pierce the gloom. Servants who brought him meals found them untouched, the food grown stale beneath the king's murmured recitations. It was as if he sought in those curling pages a cure for the hunger his own hand had sown. The abbots, once his greatest allies, came to plead with him. They begged that he show mercy, that he loosen his grip upon the harvest so that the people might endure another hard season. Severin heard them out in silence, his pale hands resting on the arms of a throne carved with images of saints and angels. When the abbots finished, he simply asked if they had kept perfect records of their own flocks. How many monks, how many candles burned each night, how many loaves baked for the poor? When they could not answer, he accused them of hypocrisy and betrayal. The great abbey of St. Eramund was closed within a fortnight, its monks driven out to wander the frozen fields, while Severin's scribes sealed the library and carted its books to his tower. He read them all by the flicker of a single lamp, the pages turning like dry leaves in a wind no one else could feel. Yet for all his learning, Severin knew little of the hearts that beat beyond his city's walls. In the villages, folk began to gather after dusk, creeping from house to house beneath the patient gaze of winter stars. They brought scraps of bread to share, scraps of news to pass along hidden paths. They spoke of hunger, of lost children, of empty pews where once the monks had blessed the fields. And they spoke, at last, of rebellion. The final spark came from a boy, a shepherd's son named Tomas, no older than 16 winters. He was caught stealing a sack of barley from the storehouses built beside Severin's tower. The scribes dragged him before the king, who peered down from his high seat with eyes ringed in shadows. Rather than beg for his life, Tomas spat at the king's feet. He spoke not with flowery words, but with the rough honesty of the fields, that no king who fed his ledgers before his people deserved the crown. Severin ordered the boy's tongue cut out, as Aldrich had done to Brother Hagen long before. But Tomas's mother took the boy's place upon the scaffold. She bared her neck willingly, speaking words her son could no longer form. Her death broke the last fragile thread that bound Aramore's folk to the Hollow King. When spring thawed the rivers, the city gates opened not for trade, but for the countless feet of farmers, millers, and smiths who came bearing pitchforks and pruning hooks turned to spears. Severin watched from his tower window as the streets filled with smoke, and the ledgers he so cherished were torn page from page, the ink bleeding out beneath the rain. Some say they found him in the library at last, seated among toppled shelves, a crown of parchment on his head, and books piled high around him like a fortress of brittle dreams. He did not resist as they carried him out beneath the spires he had once thought would pierce the very heavens. They buried him not among the kings beneath the marble floor, but in an unmarked grave beyond the city walls, where wildflowers now grow among the ruins of ledgers left to rot under the open sky. And in Aramore, when children learn to write their first letters, they are told the story of Severin the Hollow, that a mind fed only by books can starve the very people it was meant to serve, until there is nothing left but pages turned to dust in a forgotten tower. Where the plains of Aramore give way to the rugged eastern marches, a land of marshes, tangled forests, and low misty hills, stretches for leagues upon leagues until it meets the roaring sea. Here the folk have always lived close to the land, herders and charcoal burners, gatherers of rushes and reeds, fishermen who mend their nets by the flickering glow of driftwood fires. And in this sodden corner of the realm rose a king whose cruelty did not roar like Eamon's, nor whisper like Severin's. It festered quietly, like rot beneath a floorboard. They called him King Osric the Leech. Osric was not born a king but a second son, overlooked in the timbered hall of his father's keep. His elder brother Alaric wore the mantle of heir, a broad-shouldered youth who laughed easily, hunted boar with the clansmen, and spoke kindly at the harvest feasts. Osric, pale and narrow of frame, preferred the company of the reeves and the collectors, men who spoke in numbers rather than riddles of the heart. He learned young that coin could buy what love would not give, loyalty, secrets, and, if one was patient enough, even a crown. The old king died in the dead of winter, his hearth cold for 3 days while Alaric prepared for coronation. But the ale at the feast soured in his mouth, the boar's meat turned his stomach to ice. By dawn, the beloved heir was dead in his bed, lips black as frost-bitten berries. Few dared speak the truth aloud, but many saw the faint smile that curved Osric's mouth when the crown passed to his brow. Unlike his brother, Osric did not sit among his people. He did not ride out with the huntsmen, nor walk the sodden trails through the marshes. He ruled from a longhouse perched upon a low ridge, built of dark oak and crowned with a thatch that sagged under the damp. His hall smelled always of smoke and mildew, the rushes underfoot never quite dry. Here he received his subjects, trappers and weavers, fishmongers and peat diggers, listening not to their woes, but to their debts. Osric's hunger was never for conquest of land or glory in battle. He hungered for coin, and his realm became his larder. He taxed the boats that drifted the reed-choked rivers, the carts that ferried peat across the wet roads, the huts that huddled on stilts above the bogs. He even taxed the dead, insisting that any burial within consecrated ground must pay a fee in silver pennies, lest the departed find no peace beneath the marsh's shifting soil. To gather his dues, Osric kept no shining knights, but rather a swarm of petty bailiffs, thin men on thin horses, clad in drab cloaks the color of the reeds they hid within. They appeared at dawn or dusk, tapping on cottage doors with sticks of willow cut fresh from the fen. Should the house fail to yield its measure of coin, the bailiffs would claim whatever they found: nets, blankets, the carved cradles that rocked the marshland babes to sleep. What little rebellion stirred in those sodden villages was swiftly drowned in fear. Osric did not keep dungeons like Aldrich, nor libraries like Severin. He kept ledgers and gallows. The gallows rose beside the longhouse, a crooked shape that loomed in the morning mist, its ropes slick with dew. The bailiffs made a ritual of hanging a debtor at each full moon, the bodies left to sway above the rushes until the crows grew fat on spoiled flesh. The villagers came not to watch, but because they were made to stand witness, so they might remember the cost of an unpaid coin. But coins, like blood, run dry if drawn too often. When the fish grew scarce and the peat turned sour and heavy in the sodden pits, the people began to hide their wealth beneath the marsh. They buried copper jars in the roots of alder trees, sewed silver into the hems of their cloaks, or melted it into lumps no bailiff would think to weigh. Rumors spread of bog witches who whispered charms to keep Osric's men away from hidden hoards. Osric responded by sending his bailiffs deeper into the fen, rooting through huts and reed beds alike. They dug up fire pits, overturned fish traps, pressed children for secrets while mothers wept into their sleeves. Yet no amount of search returned the river's silver or brought back the fish that fled the poisoned streams. Osric's coffers shrank, his appetite only swelled. At last, the king found a new vein to drain, the abbey that rose on a low island of stone amid the reeds. For centuries, the marsh folk had carried their dead there by flat-bottomed boats through misty channels to lay them in dry crypts above the floodline. The monks kept the graves, chanted prayers in the candlelit chapel, brewed simple ale from marsh barley, and gave out bread to the hungry. Osric claimed the abbey's land and coin for his own. He arrived by boat one dawn, wrapped in a cloak of gray fur, with bailiffs at his back and ledgers bound in eel skin. He found the monks at prayer and scattered their candles into the rushes. The abbot, an old man called Brother Ruark, stood barefoot before the king, mud seeping up between his toes, as he begged Osric to remember the souls that rested here. Osric only smiled his thin, cold smile, the same smile he had worn when Alaric's breath left him in a frost-bitten room. Brother Ruark was hung from the gallows that very night, his white robes drifting like a ghost above the waterlogged ground. But the people did not stand silent as they once had. They came at dusk, torches hidden beneath their cloaks, boats drifting silent as owls along the dark channels. They rose not with spears nor swords, but with fire and ropes and stones pulled from the old abbey walls. The longhouse of the Leech King burned where it perched upon the ridge, its thatch hissing and spitting sparks into the damp wind. Osric, they say, tried to flee through the reed beds, clutching a chest of silver so heavy he could scarcely drag it behind him. He vanished into the black marsh under a waning moon, swallowed by bog and mist alike. When dawn came, they found the chest cracked open upon a bed of rotting lilies, but no sign of the king remained. To this day, the marsh folk say the fen took him back, coins clutched in dead hands, drifting somewhere beneath the water where no sun may reach. And if a man stands too close to the reed-choked banks at night, he may hear the suck and squelch of mud that never lets go, and see, just for a heartbeat, a pale face beneath the water, still hungry for what the living will no longer give. Beyond the marshes of Osric's drowned kingdom lay a realm of stone and smoke, where hills rose like the crests of sleeping giants and black forests clothed the slopes in an evergreen cloak. This was the land of Grendelholt, a fortress realm older than any parchment could recall, where mountain passes were guarded by iron gates, and the mines beneath the peaks groaned with the labors of generations. In this place of cold wind and deeper shadows ruled King Balthus the Iron Hand, whose name still rings in old songs sung low by firesides when the wind rattles shutters in the dead of night. Balthus was not a king by birth, but by conquest. He was born to the hammer, the son of a blacksmith in a high valley where smoke from the forges mixed with the mist that crept down from the peaks. Even as a boy, he was strong, his fists like mallets, his arms roped with muscle before he was grown. They said he could bend iron rods across his knee and crack anvils with a single blow if the mood took him. When the old king's line withered, snuffed out by a feud that left the throne room slick with blood, Balthus rose not through inheritance but by right of strength. He gathered the smiths, the miners, the ironmongers, and the masons. men who knew the worth of hard hands and harder tools. With hammers and pickaxes, they stormed the mountain keep, striking down lords clad in silk and chain alike. By dawn, the Iron Hand sat upon a throne that smelled of hot steel and fresh blood, and the forge fires never dimmed again. At first, the people of Grindelholt praised him. He drove out the last petty nobles who had bled the miners dry for gold they never tasted. He reopened the old iron veins, bracing the mines with beams that sang when the wind blew through the shafts. He decreed fair shares of ore to every family whose sons labored beneath the peaks. His rule, like his forge, burned hot and honest. But iron must be worked with care, lest it grow brittle and cruel. It began when Balthus decided that Grindelholt's wealth must not only feed itself, but bend the kingdoms beyond its crags to his will. He dreamed of towers clad in iron plates that no siege could breach, of roads paved with slag and crushed stone, so his armies might march faster than any foe could flee. To build this dream, he drove the miners deeper into the roots of the mountains, demanding more ore, more coal, more sweat and blood. Soon the old tunnels, carved by fathers and grandfathers, were not enough. New shafts bit deeper than any dared before, into veins where the rock wept black water and the timbers creaked like the bones of ancient beasts. Collapses grew common. Once a month, then once a week, the mountains shuddered and swallowed men whole. Widows gathered in the shadow of the keep, clutching lanterns and prayers, but Balthus would not stop the digging. He paid the widows in iron coin, stamped with his hammer and fist sigil, and ordered orphan sons to the forges and mines as soon as they could swing a pick. He built great machines, bellows that roared day and night, furnaces that glowed like the pits of some deep hell. Smoke poured from the slopes of Grindelholt until the snow itself turned gray, and the pines dropped their needles in drifts of black ash. Yet Balthus would not see the ruin he wrought. He walked the ramparts of his iron-plated keep, clad in mail forged by his own hand, his crown a circlet of steel that bit into his brow. He ate little, slept less, and spoke most often to his master-smiths, urging them to shape yet more weapons, stronger armor, gears and chains that might bind the world to his will. When they faltered, he raged, his voice booming through the stone halls like a hammer striking an anvil. Some say he had a son, a boy called Orin, who watched his father's forge fires from the shadows. Orin was no smith. His hands were soft with parchment and quills, for he lingered in the libraries the old kings had kept, studying histories of realms that rose and fell like sparks from a dying flame. He saw what Balthus could not. That iron alone could not hold what human hearts refused to carry. One winter, when the winds shrieked through the high passes and the mines flooded with black meltwater, Orin stood before his father in the great hall. He begged Balthus to close the deepest shafts, to let the mountains rest lest they crumble under their own wounded bones. Balthus listened with eyes like slag, glowing with a fire that would not be quenched. He called his son soft, weak as raw ore, unworthy of the Iron Crown. Orin fled into the high forests, taking with him a handful of miners who could dig no more. They vanished into the snowbound hollows and hidden valleys where Balthus's bailiffs would not follow. From there, they spread stories of shafts collapsing for want of shoring beams stolen for the king's new battlements, of water seeping into tunnels like the veins of a dying beast. It was not steel that brought the Iron Hand low, but stone and frost. One bitter dawn, deep in the lowest tunnel, a great seam of iron split open, pouring freezing water through the shaft in a roar like thunder. The flood rose so fast that hundreds drowned before the alarm bells could ring. The mines groaned and collapsed inward, swallowing forges, cranes, and men alike. When word reached Balthus in his iron keep, he descended into the ruins himself, alone but for a single torch. They say he wandered the flooded galleries, boots splashing through icy pools, his hammer clutched in one hand, as if he might strike the very mountain and force it to yield once more. He never returned to the ramparts. Some claim he drowned in the dark with the men he had driven beyond endurance. Others whisper that the mountain took him for its own, sealing him forever behind a wall of stone and frozen water. And when the wind howls through the broken shafts of Grindelholt, some swear they hear the clang of a hammer echoing far below. Balthus the Iron Hand, forging in the dark for an empire that never came to be. Now, when the smiths of Grendelholt strike their anvils at dusk, they pause to listen between blows, half fearing they might hear the answering ring of a hammer too heavy to lift, reminding them that even the strongest iron must bend or break when its maker forgets the fire's mercy. North of Grendelholt's ashen peaks and broken shafts lies a kingdom that seems, at first glance, a gentler place. A realm of wide meadows stitched with wildflowers and sleepy rivers that wind through villages with thatched roofs and orchards heavy with fruit. In these softer lands stood the domain of King Almeric the Pious, a ruler whose name is still spoken in fearful prayers when the bells toll at midnight and the wind rattles old church doors. For it is said that no king clothed his cruelty in such holy silk as Almeric did, and no crown gleamed so brightly with false mercy. Almeric was born beneath stained glass and incense smoke. His father, King Theobald, was a pious man who spent more time kneeling before the cathedral's gilded altar than upon the throne. His mother, a queen of noble blood and quiet sorrow, died birthing her only child beneath the echoing vaults of that same great cathedral. They christened the boy among 1,000 flickering candles, naming him for an ancient saint, said to have driven serpents from the realm with but a word and a blessing. Young Almeric grew beneath the watchful eyes of bishops and abbots, his cradle set within echoing cloisters where monks whispered prayers over his slumber. He learned his letters from parchment older than the towers themselves, and spoke not of knights and tournaments, but of relics, bones of saints, shrouds, splinters of crosses said to cure plague or sin or grief. When his father passed into the tomb, Almeric was crowned with hymns and incense. He stepped from the cathedral's marble steps clad in robes woven with threads of gold and words of salvation on his lips. The people wept to see him, so pale, so beautiful, so certain in his promise that holiness would bind their kingdom closer to the divine. And for a time, it seemed true. He built churches in every village, shrines along the roads where weary travelers might kneel and leave a coin for the poor. He summoned relic traders from far lands, men who brought with them splinters of bone and cloth and nail, each with a parchment of dubious blessing. Almeric bought them all. He displayed these treasures in glass cases and golden reliquaries, parading them through city streets on feast days, so petals rained from windows and old widows knelt in the dust to kiss his passing hem. But holiness can be hoarded like gold, and Almeric learned quickly that where faith blooms, so too can power root deep. The relics came at a cost, and the cost was the people's bread. Tithes swelled year upon year, first 1/10, then 1/5, until every hearth fire flickered with the fear of the king's collectors at the door. Those who could not pay in coin gave goats, grain, the labor of their sons. Priests walked beside the collectors, carrying croziers and books of blessings to soothe uneasy minds as the barns emptied and the fields lay fallow for want of seed. Still, Almeric wept at the altar each Sunday. He wept for their sins, he said, for their stubbornness, their hidden greed that made such sacrifice necessary. When a village rose up, tired of giving their last sheaves to gild another reliquary, he sent not knights but friars armed with parchment and excommunication writ bold in crimson ink. Those who would not kneel found their families barred from the churchyard, their dead left to sleep in unconsecrated soil, where the wind moaned over unblessed graves. In the cathedral, Almeric slept less and less. He spent nights pacing beneath arches carved with angels, his fingers tracing each pillar's cold stone as if seeking comfort. Some say he began to hear voices in the dark, saints whispering that his people's faith was weak, that only deeper sacrifice might cleanse the land of hidden corruption. So came the pilgrimage decree. Almeric commanded every household to send one soul, man, woman, or child, to the great cathedral in the capital, there to pray for absolution and the realm's salvation. They came by the thousands, trudging muddy roads in ragged cloaks, blistered feet wrapped in linen scraps. They camped in fields around the marble spires, living on crusts of bread while Almeric watched from his balcony, weeping tears they believed holy as he blessed them with a lifted hand. The cathedral could not hold them all. The city's wells turned foul, the air choked with smoke from endless fires, where pilgrims burned scraps of wood for warmth. Pestilence bloomed like mold in a damp cellar, creeping from tent to tent, from mother to child. Those who fell were gathered in carts and buried in mass graves at the city's edge. Unblessed earth once more, for the priests could not keep pace with the dying. Still, Almeric prayed. He locked himself in the reliquary vault, fasting for days beside the bones and splinters he had hoarded, murmuring that the sacrifice must continue until all sin was cleansed. Servants who brought him water found him gaunt as a hermit, his eyes sunken pools reflecting candlelight and madness alike. One dawn, when the bells tolled for yet another funeral, a monk named Anselm crept into the reliquary. Anselm had once loved the king as a brother, a boyhood friend who carried his books and walked with him among the orchard groves beyond the cloister walls. Now he found Almeric sprawled among jeweled caskets and holy fragments, clutching a saint's fingerbone as though it might breathe life back into a realm grown pale with grief. Anselm knelt beside him. He did not beg or plead. He simply whispered that the people were dying while their king wept for their souls instead of feeding their bodies. Almeric looked at him with eyes that did not seem to see, murmuring that the kingdom must be pure or not at all. No record tells what words passed between them after. Only that when the sun rose full above the cathedral's spires, Almeric the Pious was found at the altar, his throat laid open by a small monastic blade, his robes soaked not in incense but in his own cooling blood. Anselm was gone, vanished into the forests that lay beyond the pilgrim roads. Some say he lived out his days tending the sick in hidden chapels. Others say he fled across the sea, bearing with him one relic, a single broken piece of wood that, perhaps, was never holy at all. Yet in Almeric's kingdom, no relic is ever displayed without a whispered prayer that mercy may temper faith, and that no crown, however pious, may drink so deep of holiness that it forgets the simple grace of bread, shelter, and the warm hush of a quiet grave. Far to the west of Almeric's cathedral realm, where the land met the restless gray sea in cliffs that rose sheer and jagged from the foam, there lay a coastal kingdom known for its salt and storms. The people there were a hardy folk, fishermen, shipwrights, and sailors, whose songs were torn by the wind long before they reached inland fields. And perched upon the highest bluff above the roaring tide stood the keep of King Hadrian the Drowned, a monarch whose thirst for power sank deeper than any anchor ever dropped into the fathomless deep. Hadrian was born of salt and spray, the youngest son of a line of sea kings who traced their blood back to raiders and corsairs. His childhood was spent clambering barefoot over slick rocks, watching the tide drag driftwood and secrets ashore. He learned early that the sea gave and the sea took, and he swore as a boy kneeling on barnacled stone that he would tame its taking once he wore the crown. When his father's ship vanished beneath a storm-black sky, Hadrian's elder brother donned the crown and pledged to steer their people to calmer harbors. But calm did not suit the younger prince. He whispered to the harbor captains, bribed the salt tax collectors, offered casks of wine and silver coins to the men who crewed the king's fleet. In a single night, the royal flagship burned at anchor while the brothers slept ashore. By dawn, Hadrian walked the salt-slick steps to the throne room, the sea wind at his back, and a new crown hammered hastily from the wreck's salvaged iron. To his people, he spoke of glory. He promised fleets that would roam farther than any before, nets that would drag in fish enough to feed 10 kingdoms. He offered ships to poor fishermen, sails and lines and hooks, so long as they bent knee to his new salt tithe, a share of every catch, no matter how small, pledged to Hadrian's coffers. At first, it seemed fair enough. The sea was bountiful, the shoals thick with herring and cod. The salt pans along the marshy inlets hissed day and night, piles of coarse white crystals filling barrels that rolled onto ships bound for distant ports. Hadrian's halls filled with silver and spices, bolts of silk from traders who came to barter beneath his high stone keep. But Hadrian's hunger was not for wealth alone. He dreamed of an empire built on the salt-slick decks of ships, an armada vast enough to choke every harbor from the western fjords to the warm southern bays. He ordered the forests felled inland, oak after oak dragged to the shipyards until the hills stood bare and raw under the rain. He conscripted boys barely old enough to tie a knot, sending them to sea in new ships that cracked and wept salt water through fresh seams. Each spring, more ships left the harbor than returned. The storms grew cruel, or so it seemed, great green waves that shattered hulls like driftwood, winds that shredded sails and scattered the fishing fleets like gulls before a squall. Widows lined the docks with salt-stung eyes, clutching dried sprigs of kelp and bits of driftwood nailed into crude crosses for the drowned. Still, Hadrian pressed them harder. He levied new taxes on the catch, the salt, the ropes and nails that bound the ships together. He built lighthouses not to guide his people home, but to mark the edges of his claim, towers of black stone that stabbed at the sky, burning pitch and whale oil night after night, so that every ship's crew might remember to whom the sea now belonged. Some whispered that Hadrian feared the sea's deep hunger more than he feared man's rebellion. They said he woke at night to the sound of waves smashing against the cliffs far below his chamber window, that he heard voices in the roaring surf, names of the dead called back on the tide. His servants found him standing barefoot on the wet stones at dawn, salt crusting his hair and beard, eyes staring out to the horizon as if he waited for something vast and terrible to rise from the fathoms. One winter, a storm like none before tore across the coastal realm. Ships snapped their anchor chains and floundered on the rocks. Salt pans vanished under the surge, barrels smashed and scattered like toys. The keep itself shook beneath the howling wind, its walls slick with brine blown in sheets from the sea below. In the village harbors, fishermen and shipwrights gathered in the battered boathouses, shivering in their soaked cloaks. They spoke not of mutiny, for they had no ships left to seize. Instead, they spoke of the tide, and of an old tale buried deep in their grandfathers' salt-rhymed songs, that the sea would claim any king who believed he could chain its hunger. When the wind at last fell silent, they climbed the cliffs to the keep. They found Hadrian in his great hall, alone among barrels of salt cracked open by the storm's breath. The sea's roar below was answered by the drip of water through the roof where slates had torn away. The king sat upon his salt throne, a monstrous chair carved from blocks of crystal harvested from the pans. His crown, too, was salt, fragile, flaking, melting in beads that ran down his hair and into his staring eyes. He did not speak when they entered, only lifted one hand as if to hush the crashing waves beyond the walls. Some say he opened his mouth to beg forgiveness, but only seawater poured out, as if the tide had found its way into his very lungs. They left him there, Hadrian the drowned, enthroned forever among the ruin of his salt hoard, while the cliffs crumbled beneath the endless hunger of the waves. And ever since, when storms batter the western harbors and the tide swallows boats whole, fishermen swear they glimpse a pale figure on the highest bluff, watching the horizon, crown of salt dissolving, waiting for the sea's mercy that never comes. Inland, from the salt-scoured cliffs, where Hadrian's ghost still lingers in storm and spray, the land rolls into broad plains and low hills stitched with hedgerows and ancient stone fences. Here, where wildflowers wave in the breeze and shepherds guide flocks across green pastures, rose the domain of King Corvinus the Masked, a ruler whose cruelty hid not behind iron or relic or storm, but behind a painted smile that few ever saw slip. Corvinus was born to a house already steeped in rumor. His mother, Queen Isolda, died when he was yet a babe. Poisoned, it was said, by a goblet of wine meant for his father, a king known for his secret trysts and silent enemies. The old king grew ever more suspicious after her death, retreating into a private wing of the royal manor, surrounded by guards and whispering courtiers who carried daggers as often as scrolls. Corvinus, left to the care of wet nurses and tutors, was a lonely child. He wandered the vast corridors of the manor at dusk, small slippered feet echoing off cold stone. It was in those halls, half forgotten by the living, that he found the mask, an actor's prop, crafted of lacquered wood, its features frozen in an eternal, gentle smile. They say he wore it first to frighten his nursemaids into giving him sweets, but soon he found it suited him in ways that no soft words or royal silk could. When his father died, some say by his own hand, others by poison no cupbearer dared confess to, Corvinus stepped from the manor's shadows already masked. He wore it at the coronation feast, painted gold and crimson to match the banners that draped the hall. When the lords and knights asked why the young king hid his face, he only smiled beneath the wood and told them that a king's true heart was a burden too heavy for subjects to bear. At first, Corvinus seemed harmless enough. He walked among his people, mask glinting in the sunlight, speaking softly to farmers and millers, stroking children's hair with a gloved hand. He threw festivals, lavish things with painted actors, jugglers, and musicians who danced until dawn under lanterns strung from oak to oak. He ordered great feasts after every harvest, tables groaning with roasts and pies, flagons of spiced wine poured freely. But for each loaf of bread freely given, a debt was whispered behind closed doors. His collectors, men clad in motley like jesters, faces hidden behind painted half-masks, roamed the countryside when the festivals ended. They knocked on cottage doors, polite as parish priests, demanding repayment not in coin, but in favors, oaths, and silence. A miller who failed to grind the king's grain without question found his stone smashed to powder. A shepherd who let his flock stray without paying tribute discovered his pasture set ablaze in the night. Yet Corvinus's cruelty was not always so plain. He reveled in the theater of mercy, staging trials in his marble courtyard beneath fluttering banners of gold and green. There, before crowds who cheered and trembled all at once, he judged thieves, debtors, and traitors, while actors mimed their sins behind him. Exaggerated pantomimes that mocked the accused, while the king's mask turned gently from side to side, a smile forever frozen in benevolence. Sometimes he pardoned them, lifting his gloved hand as if to bless a kneeling sinner. But those pardoned rarely made it home. They vanished on moonless nights, carried away by masked men whose painted grins glowed like pale moons in the torchlight. Whispers said the king's secret wing in the old manor, where his father once hid, was now a warren of locked rooms, where screams seeped through the tapestries like cold draughts through broken shutters. In the villages, the people began to fear the sound of laughter, the flicker of painted mummers on festival nights. They no longer crowded the feasts, nor reached for the bread piled high on the king's tables. Mothers clutched their children close when the mask bearers passed by, for none knew whose name might be marked in the hidden ledgers the jesters carried at their belts. Yet it was not a knight nor a lord who unmasked Corvinus in the end, but a girl born among the hedgerows, Aline, a beekeeper's daughter. She grew up in the hush of buzzing hives, watching how her father's hands moved gently through clouds of stinging wings, never flinching, never swatting what he could not hope to control by force. When her family's land was claimed by one of the king's jesters, over a debt invented and signed with a seal no peasant could contest, Aline went to the manor herself. She waited 3 days in the courtyard, through rain and sun and the hush of dawn birdsong. When Corvinus emerged at last, masked and robed in silk that shimmered like oil, she stepped forward and offered him a gift, a tiny wooden box bound in waxed linen. He took it with gloved hands, tilting his head as if amused by this scrap of courage. When he lifted the lid, a single queen bee crawled out onto the lacquered mask, its legs questing along the painted grin. The king laughed, his voice thin and echoing inside the mask's hollow. Then the swarm came. Drawn by the scent of honey, Aline had brushed over the mask's lips in secret. They poured from the orchard hives she had hidden in her cloak, a living cloud that drowned out the king's laughter in a hum like a hymn for Judgment Day. The jesters scattered, shrieking as stings found flesh through bright motley cloth. The mask fell at last, torn away as Corvinus clawed at the bees that buried him in golden stripes. Beneath the painted smile, they found only another mask, his own face pale and ruined by years hidden from sun and truth alike. When the people speak of Corvinus the Masked, they do not tell his tale as one of heroism or rebellion. They whisper it as a lesson of how a mask worn too long does not merely hide a man's cruelty, but feeds it, until there is no face left beneath, only a painted grin waiting for the hive's soft, righteous hum. In the cold hush of an early winter's dawn, a hush broken only by the sighing wind through the bare boughs of the northern woods, the legacy of King Torvald the Iron Hand still trembled like a ghost upon the lips of those who dared recall him. For years he had sat his throne of black oak and cold iron, a grim figure clad in wolf pelts and chainmail, even as he held court. His realm, once a modest holdfast upon the edge of the known kingdoms, had swelled into a vast and grudging dominion. Yet the manner of its expansion was spoken of in murmurs behind bolted doors, for Torvald's conquest was not one of noble banners or chivalrous charge, but of whispers in the dark, poisoned cups, and the silent dread that crept like frost beneath every hearth. The people of the Northmark, his first subjects, still remembered the old days before Torvald's rise, days of small folk tending sheep upon high pastures, of long feasts beneath timbered roofs, of laughter carrying over frozen rivers. They remembered, too, the first signs of his ambition, the quiet gathering of iron, the forging of new blades in secret smithies hidden beneath the cliffs, the strange disappearance of old lords who once kept their own counsel. When the day came that Torvald declared himself king of the Northmark, there was no battle, no clash of shields, only doors thrown wide by men whose families slept beneath his mercy, and the cold realization that the old ways had been buried beneath the snow. In those first years, Torvald ruled with a rough fairness that masked the iron undercurrent of his will. He walked among his people clad in furs and battered mail, an axe slung at his back, and spoke of unity and strength in the face of southern kingdoms who looked upon the north with greedy eyes. Many found hope in his harsh words. Better a hard king of their own than a softer one from afar. But as the seasons turned, so too did Torvald's heart. Or perhaps it was only ever a mask that cracked beneath the weight of power. He took to riding alone through the forests, clad in black, and those who crossed his path unbidden were seldom seen again. Whispers spoke of secret councils in the night, where enemies were not confronted but erased, their names struck from the rolls of noble blood as though they had never drawn breath. Some said Torvald kept a circle of shadow walkers, silent men who bore no sigils and answered only to his voice. They carried out deeds too vile for daylight. A rival's hall burned with all its kin inside, a loyal captain found drowned beneath the ice with stones sewn into his belly. Yet worse than this quiet terror was Torvald's hunger for the south. When his armies first crossed the Frostward Pass into the lush valleys of Avalor, his men were hungry wolves unleashed upon sheepfolds. Villages fell silent overnight. The peasants who fled brought stories of slaughter so ruthless that even the blood-soaked warbands of the steppe lords paled in comparison. And yet, as town after town bent the knee, Torvald's legend grew. The Iron Hand, they called him, for no fortress could resist his grip. No rebellion could pry his fingers loose once he closed them around a province's throat. Inside his cold stone keep at Drakenhall, Torvald surrounded himself with trophies of his conquests, banners torn from castle walls, the gilded armor of slain lords, and, it was said, the skulls of those whose line he ended mounted in alcoves behind his high seat. No minstrel sang in his court, save those whose tongues praised his might, and dared not utter word of the cruelties that birthed it. The people beyond Drakenhall's walls learned to bow deeper with each passing year, for the Iron Hand's tax collectors came clad in steel, and his justice was swift and wordless. It was in this twilight of his reign that a tale began to take root in the hush of winter firesides, a tale not of Torvald's might, but of a lone girl who had seen too much. Her name, if one can trust the hush of rumor, was Astrid, daughter of a minor reeve, whose village lay upon the edge of the Frostward Pass. She had been but a child when Torvald's men came riding through like a storm of iron and torchlight. They had left her father hanging from the branches of a bare ash tree, a warning to any who might think to resist the Iron Hand's levy. Astrid, it is said, fled into the forests, living by the grace of root and stream, hidden by the old spirits. The Northmen swore still lingered among stone circles and deep glades. And as she grew, so too did her story, that she spoke with the wind and the wolves, that she knew secret paths through the mountains, that she carried within her the voice of the Old North, an echo of freedom no tyrant could silence. Some scoffed at the notion, a lone girl defying a king who could raise cities with a word. Yet in Drakenhall, Torvald began to dream restless dreams. He saw a white wolf in the snow, eyes like embers, and behind it, a girl's shadow flitting through the pines. He ordered his hunters into the high hills, offering gold for any sign of this phantom. None returned with proof, yet still the Iron Hand slept uneasy. In the final winters of his reign, strange happenings stirred his people's fear. Outposts along the Frostward Pass found their stores spoiled overnight. Men awoke to find the heads of Torvald's black riders spiked upon the palisades. Tracks in the snow led away into the forest, vanishing beneath ancient standing stones where the old ways were said to linger strongest. Yet Torvald would not yield to shadows. He doubled his patrols, hung entire villages in retaliation, and had his scribes pen new decrees of loyalty. His court, once grim but ordered, now quaked beneath his rages. He trusted no one. His old captains vanished one by one, replaced by hollow-eyed men more loyal to his fear than his cause. Still the stories of Astrid spread. Some swore she was no mere girl, but the spirit of the North given flesh, a reckoning for every heart that burned in silence, every child left to starve in the snows while Torvald's vaults brimmed with plundered gold. Folk clung to this tale like a prayer whispered through frostbitten lips, that when the time came, the Iron Hand would find his own strength turned to rust, undone not by armies, but by a single breath of wild, forgotten freedom. And so, in the hush of each long night, as the wind rattled shutters and wolves howled far beyond the torchlight, the people waited. They waited for the Iron Hand's grip to falter, for the shadow in the woods to step into the fire's glow. They waited and dreamed of the day when the coldest tyrant ever to wear a northern crown would find himself alone at last, facing not an enemy's sword, but the vast silence of a land he could never truly claim. When the first thaw came to the Northmark that fateful spring, it did not bring with it the usual signs of gentle renewal. No singing streams broke free in joyous babble, no shy buds opened beneath the pale sun. Instead, the thaw revealed what the snows had hidden: shattered homesteads, fields scorched black where once the barley had swayed, and lonely watchtowers leaning like broken teeth against the sky. The people who had survived the long winter under Torvald's iron reign found little warmth in the returning light. They moved like ghosts through villages too quiet, tending to what little flocks remained, always casting wary glances toward the forests that hemmed them in. For within those forests, Astrid's legend breathed deeper with every rumor. It was said that bands of ragged folk, driven from their homes by Torvald's tax collectors and soldiers, had fled into the pine-shadowed hills to join her. There, beneath stone circles older than any king, they spoke of freedom in hushed, fervent voices. They shared tales of nights when they crept like foxes to waylay the Iron Hand supply trains, leaving wagons burning in the dark while their laughter echoed through the trees. No single soul saw Astrid herself clearly. Some claimed she moved among them wearing a cloak of white wolf pelts, her hair tangled with pine needles and frost. Others swore she was no more than a whisper, a promise of revolt passed from mouth to mouth so that even the wind seemed to carry her defiance. Word of these shadows in the woods reached Drakenhall like a sickness the court could not purge. Torvald's black riders, those who still remained, were sent in ever greater numbers, iron shod and torch in hand, to hunt this phantom rebellion to its root. But the deeper they pressed into the wilds, the more they found themselves hunted in turn. A snapped branch, a flicker of movement in the trees, the soft hiss of an arrow through the mist, many such patrols never returned, or limped back days later, frostbitten and wide-eyed, their stories too tangled to believe. In the midst of this unrest, Torvald grew restless within his cold hall. The Iron Hand, who once had stalked the keep like a wolf among dogs, now seemed coiled upon his throne like a snake grown wary of its own coils. He took to pacing the battlements at night, clad in black furs and a mail shirt that clinked like distant chimes in the stillness. His eyes, once fierce and sharp as a hawk's, seemed hunted themselves, scanning the forest that crept ever closer in his thoughts. He summoned his oldest advisors, those gray-bearded thanes who had stood beside him when first he broke the Northmark to his will. But even they found no comfort in his presence now. At night, he demanded counsel for hours on end. How to root out this wildling girl, how to break the back of rebellion before it spread like spring fire through dry grass. He struck the stone floor with his iron-banded fist when none could give him the answers he craved. Meanwhile, beyond Drakenhall's walls, the people who had once cowered beneath his taxes and punishments found new boldness in Astrid's legend. Small acts of defiance sprouted like green shoots through hard earth. A bailiff found his ledger stolen and burned upon the village square. A supply depot meant for Torvald's garrison was found empty, its stores spirited away into the hills. Even in towns that still declared fealty with trembling lips, prayers for the Iron Hand's downfall drifted behind shuttered windows each night. Yet for all this swelling tide, Astrid remained more ghost than general. She did not declare herself queen or call for open banners upon the wind. Instead, she wove her rebellion like a net of unseen threads. Each whispered promise, each stolen loaf, each arrow loosed in the dark tightening that net around Torvald's mind. It was not armies she raised, but doubt itself, and that was a poison no fortress wall could bar out. In the southern reaches of the Northmark, where the land softened into gentle valleys and half-forgotten trade roads, an old knight named Sir Edric watched these rumors drift northward like migrating geese. Edric had once sworn his sword to Torvald in the first conquests, back when the Iron Hand's promise of unity seemed like salvation against southern plunderers. For decades, Edric had held his keep in uneasy loyalty, enforcing the king's taxes and sending his sons to Torvald's wars. But now age and a deep wariness weighed upon him heavier than any suit of armor. When word of Astrid reached Edric's hall, a ragged boy clutching a message hidden in a loaf of stale bread, he sat long by his hearth, turning the parchment in trembling hands. It bore no royal seal, only a simple sign, a wolf's paw, drawn in charcoal. Beneath it, just a single line written in a steady, careful hand. Come to the circle of standing stones before the thaw is done. For a night and a day, Edric weighed this summons like a man weighing his soul. His household urged caution. Some whispered that it was a trap laid by Torvald himself, a way to root out old knights whose loyalty had grown brittle with time. Others urged him to stand fast, to hold to his oaths as the snows melted around his keep. But in the hush before dawn, Edric made his choice. He rose from his bed without a word, donned his old mail, and saddled his gray warhorse whose back had grown as bowed as its master's. He told no one where he rode, only that they were to bar the gates behind him and speak his name to no rider who came asking. Thus it was that as the pale sun climbed over the ragged peaks, Sir Edric passed from the known paths of loyalty into the deep forest's hush, where the snow clung to ancient stones and the wind spoke secrets to those willing to listen. There, among the pine and moss, he would seek the ghost of a girl who might yet break an Iron Hand's grip, not with a clash of steel, but with the silent power of a people who had remembered how to dream of freedom once more. Deep within the hush of those old woods, where the undergrowth lay soft with fallen needles and the morning mist rose in curling ribbons, Sir Edric rode on, his breath a cloud in the chill dawn air. The path before him was no true road, only a hunter's track winding through stands of pine and birch, their trunks pale as old bones in the dim light. Each hoofbeat seemed louder than a hammer's strike in that vast hush, and more than once he paused, listening for any sign that he was not alone. Behind him, the world he had known for so long fell away with each turning mile. Stonekeep, loyal retainers, the weight of a title that once meant protection but had grown cold with compromise. Ahead lay only the promise of a name, Astrid, whispered like a spell among the folk who still dared to hope. He had no illusions of what his presence might mean. One old knight could not swing the balance of kingdoms. Yet something in that simple sign, the wolf's paw inked in charcoal, stirred an ember that had not wholly died in Edric's chest. By midday, the sun had climbed just high enough to fracture the forest gloom. Shafts of pale gold broke through the canopy, catching on motes of dust and the breath of the land itself. It was there, in that liminal light, that Edric found the stones. They rose from a clearing like giants half buried by time, tall slabs of granite worn smooth by countless winters, set in a wide circle that no farmer or mason alive could claim to have raised. Moss clung to their bases, and tiny white flowers, first heralds of spring, pushed bravely through the leaf mold. He dismounted, the old leather of his saddle creaking like tired joints, and led his horse to the edge of the clearing. For a long moment he simply stood, listening. The forest around him seemed to breathe, branches whispering, a thrush calling far off, the faint creak of trees shifting against each other. Yet there was another sound too, so soft he almost thought it imagined, a single footstep, careful as snowfall. He turned slowly and found her there, half-shadowed among the birch trunks. She was not the spectral figure of rumor, no silver-eyed phantom wrapped in wolfskins, but a young woman clad in a rough-spun cloak the color of wet bark, her hair braided tight against the wind. In her eyes, though, There was something that did not belong to any simple village maid, something fierce and clear, like a flame that could not be snuffed out by any tyrant's decree. "Sir Edric," she said, her voice low but steady, "you came." He inclined his head, feeling the weight of his mail and years settle upon him like a second cloak. "I came because I have grown tired of watching good folks starve while the Iron Hand gorges on their fear." Astrid stepped closer into the pale clearing, boots brushing the thaw-soft earth. "Many have grown tired," she said, her gaze holding his without flinching. "But few cross the threshold, fewer still with their names unhidden." He barked a quiet laugh, hoarse but warm despite the cold. "When you have seen as many winters as I, girl, you learn that a hidden name is worth little. I would rather stand here, open and plain, than die behind a barred door when his shadow falls." Astrid looked past him, at the stones that ringed them like silent witnesses. These were raised before any king claimed this land, before crowns and taxes and iron hands. My father told me the old folk believed such circles were doors. Not to some other world, but to the oldest part of this one, where people remembered who they were before fear taught them to bow. Edric nodded, understanding blooming in the hush between them. "And you would open that door again." "I would remind them," she said. Her hands, rough and scarred from brambles and bowstring, touched the cold granite lightly. "I cannot promise you victory, old knight, but I can promise you this. If we stand together here, then the Iron Hand's shadow will never again seem so endless." They spoke then in quiet voices while the forest kept its secrets, of what Edric could offer, of the hidden paths his foresters knew, of loyal men within Torvald's own garrisons who had seen enough blood to wonder if there might yet be another way. Astrid listened more than she spoke, marking each promise not on parchment, but in the keen light of her eyes. Around them, the stones seemed to lean closer, as if the land itself bent an ear to their fragile plot. By dusk, they had built not an army, but a seed of defiance. Edric would ride back, not to his keep, but to the outlying farms and hunting lodges to speak softly with those who still remembered his honor from better days. Astrid would remain in the deep woods, gathering her scattered folk, moving like mist from glade to glade, a rumor given breath by each frightened heart that dared to believe. When at last Edric took his leave, leading his weary horse back into the shadows, Astrid stood alone in the clearing. She placed her palm flat upon the tallest stone, feeling its cold strength seep into her bones. Above her, the first stars kindled in the bruised sky, bright and sharp through the tangle of branches. She closed her eyes and breathed the promise she had given Edric, and through him, all those who had forgotten they could stand upright beneath the weight of a tyrant's crown. The forest listened, the stones listened, and somewhere far away, in the deepening dark of Drakenhall, the Iron Hand's restless dreams shivered at the touch of a name carried on the wind, Astrid, whispered from mouth to mouth until even silence could not swallow it whole. The moon rose full and pale above the Northmark's sleeping woods, casting its ghostly sheen upon the thatch and timber of lonely farmsteads and the winding rutted tracks that stitched them together. It silvered the branches of ancient oaks and made the frost on the fields gleam like spilled salt. Beneath this cold light, Astrid's name traveled farther than any rider could hope to go. Carried on cracked lips in lamplit kitchens, in murmured prayers beside dying hearths, in hurried whispers passed between shepherds in the hills. Far to the east of Drakenhall, where the rivers ran swift and dark through deep gullies, a village called Eldreth crouched among the birch groves. It was no grand place, just a scatter of cottages, a single stone church leaning slightly as if weary with age, and a mill whose wheel turned slowly even through the thaw. Eldreth had once paid its taxes dutifully, its folk bowing heads, when Torvald's collectors arrived with their ledgers and swords. But this spring, the hush was different. Doors that once opened easily now stayed bolted when the Black Riders came calling. When asked about missing grain or vanished livestock, the villagers only shrugged, eyes wide and empty, as if they'd forgotten the weight of speech altogether. It was in this hush that a figure came walking down Eldreth's lone muddy street one night, a hooded woman moving with the care of one who knows that every step must pass unnoticed or mean death. Beneath her cloak she carried no banner, no seal, no mark of rank, only the promise of her name. At the edge of the mill pond, she paused, listening to the low groan of the water wheel, the slow drip of meltwater from the eaves. From the shadows behind the mill, another figure slipped free. A boy, not yet grown to a man's height, clutching a crude spear carved from an ash sapling. He held it steady despite the shiver in his shoulders, his eyes darting to the glint of the moon on her blade as she lifted her hood. "It's you," he breathed, voice cracking with the strain of disbelief and hope knotted too tightly in a young chest. Astrid. She did not smile. Hers was not a face for easy warmth these days, but her eyes softened. "And you are Henrik, the wheelwright's youngest." The boy lowered his spear, the point dipping into the wet earth. "My brother told me you'd come," he said. "He said the forest listens when you speak." "The forest listens to any who remember how," Astrid answered. She stepped closer, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. He flinched at first. Few were untouched by the iron hand's reach, but steadied when he saw no threat in her touch. "Tell me, the food, where do you hide it?" Henrik swallowed, then nodded towards the black ridge of trees beyond the last cottage. "The old charcoal pits. Father says the collectors fear the bogs and spirits there. We carry sacks at night. Take just enough that they think the rats did it." Astrid's gaze flickered to the cottages, the dim flicker of hearthlight behind shutters nailed tight. "And your father, does he stand with you?" A hesitation, brief but sharp as the snap of a twig. He fears what Torvald will do, but my brother says fear is just another chain. If we break it, then the Iron Hand has nothing left to bind you." She released his shoulder and stepped back, her cloak swirling like a restless shadow. "You've done well. Keep your hands clean of open fight for now. Hunger is our first blade. Each loaf kept from his soldiers weakens him more than a spilled cup of blood." Henrik nodded, though his fingers tightened on the spear shaft. "Some say we should strike, burn the tax wagons, slit the throats of the black riders when they sleep." "And they are not wrong to wish it," Astrid said softly. "But not yet. A storm too soon only feeds the Iron Hand's wrath. He would crush us in open field, and the people would watch and learn fear all over again." She drew from her cloak a small leather pouch and pressed it into his hands. It clinked softly. A handful of coins, more than Henrik had ever held at once. "Salt and dried meat for your people," she murmured. "Trade it only with those you trust. The old charcoal burner in the pines, he is one of ours. He'll guide you." A faint sound made them both tense, a soft shuffle near the mill's side wall. Astrid's hand fell to the hilt at her belt, the steel half drawn before a figure stepped from the shadows. A woman, hair bound beneath a frayed scarf, hands held out to show she bore no weapon. Henrik let out a breath. "Mother," he whispered. "She followed me." Astrid did not sheath her blade at once. The woman's eyes met hers, dark, deep with worry but not fear. She did not look away from the cold gleam of steel. "You are the girl," she said at last, voice barely more than the creak of the mill's wheel. "The one they hunt like a fox through these woods." "I am," Astrid answered. The woman's gaze shifted to her son. Her hand found his shoulder, squeezed it hard enough to anchor him to the earth. Then, with a careful nod, she looked at Astrid once more. "If you bring my boy into this, you bring me too. The men will not stand openly, but the women, we keep the hearth. We know where food hides, where rumors sleep." Astrid studied her, the tight lines of her face, the way the night wind tangled her hair but did not bow her head. "What is your name?" "Birgit," the woman said simply. Astrid sheathed her blade at last. "Then stand with me, Birgit of Vajrathrisa. The time will come when the hearth is more powerful than the sword." They parted before dawn, the boy and his mother slipping back among the cottages like foxes in the hedgerow, while Astrid vanished once more into the birch groves. Behind her, the mill wheel turned, old and slow but tireless, whispering its watery secrets to the night. And in every hush behind every bolted door, her name found new voices, small yet unafraid, waiting for the day the Iron Hand's shadow would break at last upon the quiet, relentless strength of those who had nothing left to lose but their fear. In the heart of Drakenhall, behind its curtain walls and watchtowers bristling with pikes, King Torvald the Iron Hand sat brooding in a hall colder than any northern night. Though braziers burned along the flagstones and rushes lay fresh upon the floor, the warmth never seemed to reach him. He sat upon his black oak throne, one hand gripping the carved armrest, the other drumming an idle, restless beat against the wolf's head ring upon his finger. Rumors seep through stone as easily as wind through cracked shutters. They reached him in scraps, whispers brought by spies, confessions forced from trembling lips, messages snatched from the pouches of couriers who vanished into the dungeons beneath the keep. Always the same name, circling him like a hawk above a cornered hare, Astrid. Astrid in the woods. Astrid among the charcoal pits. Astrid at the edge of every village where men and women dared to stand a little straighter than they had in years. Torvald had built his dominion on fear, but fear, he knew too well, could be fickle. It made men bow, but it also made them dream in secret of rising when the lash grew too heavy. So now he paced the hall like a chained bear, snapping orders to scribes and captains who bent their heads to hide the unease in their eyes. This night, he had summoned them again, his last circle of trusted men, if any could truly be called that now. They stood in a crescent before his throne, Bjorn the Red, his huntsmaster and the sharpest tracker in the Frostward Hills. Captain Rurik, commander of the Black Riders, whose boots had stamped out more than one mutter of rebellion. And Sergeant Kjar, an old wolf of a man whose scarred face had seen the first stones of Drakenhall laid when Torvald's rule was still young and hungry. Torvald's voice rasped against the hush like a blade drawn across whetstone. She is a girl. A girl. Not a lord with banners, not a southerner with gold to buy traitors. A girl. And yet you stand here empty-handed while she slips through your fingers like mist. Bjorn shifted uneasily, his red beard twitching as he licked his lips. We hunt her, sire, every path, every den. You hunt shadows, Torvald snapped, rising so abruptly the torchlight caught the glint of mail beneath his cloak. The Northmark belongs to me, the woods, the rivers, every foxhole and cave, and yet you cannot find her. Captain Rurik cleared his throat, a sound like gravel shifting under boot. The people shelter her, sire. They hide her in the forests, the barns, the cellars. We burn their stores, hang those we catch. Still they cling to her name like it's some holy charm. Then break them harder, Torvald growled. He turned his glare on Kjar, whose one good eye met it unflinching. You old wolf, what would you do? Kjar spat on the rushes, a fleck of dark phlegm catching in his beard. You cannot hunt what the woods themselves shelter, sire. Fear will hold them a while yet, but fear alone won't root her out. Not now. Torvald's nostrils flared. Then speak your cure. Coin, Kjar said bluntly. Betrayal. A mother will keep her child hidden for pride, but a hungry man will sell a ghost for enough silver to buy his winter through. Loose your gold, scatter it wide. Let it be known that any who brings her to you alive will eat like a lord when the snow falls next. A cold smile flickered across Torvald's lips. It sat poorly there, more threat than humor. And if no one dares to claim it? Kjar shrugged. Then the people will turn on each other in fear that someone will. Distrust breaks fellowship faster than your Black Riders ever could. Bjorn and Rurik shifted uncomfortably, but neither spoke against the old sergeant's counsel. They had seen the Iron Hand's methods work before. Turn brother against brother, mother against son, until loyalty cracked like river ice at the first thaw. Torvald sat once more, the wolf's head ring tapping on the armrest. So be it. Spread the word. Coin for her capture. Twice that for her head if she will not come bound. Captain Rurik bowed stiffly. It will be done, sire. But as they turned to go, Torvald's voice cut through the cold hush once more. And mark this, if any of you think to keep her for your own bargain, or to play at kingslaying dreams behind my back, I will know it. I have eyes you do not see and knives you do not feel until they kiss your throat. Silence answered him, heavy as iron. The three men departed beneath the flicker of torches, their boots echoing down the stone corridor. Torvald watched them go, then rose and stepped to the window that overlooked his keep's outer walls. Beyond the battlements, the vast dark of the north spread away, stitched with thin lines of torchlight where watchfires burned. Somewhere out there, beneath pine and snow, the girl moved, this slip of a child who turned villages against him with nothing but a name and a voice that remembered freedom. His hand tightened on the sill until the old stone bit into his palm. Let them hide her, he thought. Let them hope she is their savior. Hope is soft flesh beneath my blade. Below, the wind sighed against the ramparts, carrying with it the distant howl of a wolf. Torvald turned from the window, his cloak swirling like storm clouds at his heels. The hunt would not end with hounds and swords alone. This was a different prey, one that required not just iron, but poison. And the Iron Hand was more than willing to stain his fingers deeper still. Far to the north, in a barn half buried beneath last year's hay, Astrid lay awake, her eyes open to the dark rafters, listening to the hush that carried Torvald's promise of betrayal on its breath. She felt no fear then, only the slow, steady beating of her heart, each thrum a vow that she would not break before the Iron Hand's grasp did. By the time the first heavy rains came, the Northmark was a land half mired in thaw and half gripped by lingering frost. The roads turned to sucking mud, where the iron-shod hooves of Torvald's riders churned the earth into mire. Villagers watched from behind shuttered windows as patrols passed, black cloaks slick with rain, helmets dripping, their horses gaunt from too many miles and too few oats. The Iron Hand's bounty spread on every tongue. A purse of silver for the girl called Astrid, twice that for her corpse if she would not be taken alive. At first, no one dared whisper of it aloud. But hunger is a cunning voice, and in the meaner huts where children coughed in the damp and the root cellars lay nearly bare, temptation flickered like a guttering candle. Fathers looked to sons with hard eyes. Neighbors weighed old grudges against the hush of their hearts. The Iron Hand had counted on this. Fear of betrayal breaking the fragile threads of kinship Astrid's name had begun to weave. Yet beneath the storm-racked boughs and sodden thatch, another voice worked quietly, one that did not shout promises of silver, but murmured reminders of what was at stake. It moved with Astrid's hidden folk, slipping from one village to the next like a wandering wind. They carried no banners. They bore no swords openly. But each brought news of who could be trusted, who might bend for coin, who watched with hollow eyes and found in their emptiness a place for courage to grow. In a ruined hunting lodge near the banks of the River Vale, a gathering took place that the Iron Hand's spies failed to see. The roof sagged under centuries of storms, and moss clung to the stones like a second skin. Within, a fire crackled low and smokeless. Astrid sat upon an overturned barrel, cloak drawn tight around her shoulders, hair damp, with the drip of rain through the broken rafters. Before her knelt Sir Edric, mud still caked to the hem of his old surcoat. Around them, a handful of others huddled near the warmth. Birgit of Eldrith. Her son Henrik curled at her side like a watchful fox cub. 2 foresters from the Frostward Hills with bows unstrung but ready. A smith's daughter from the border village of Storn, broad-shouldered, her arms marked with old burns. They spoke not in grand speeches, but in the plain words of folk who had no luxury for poetry. Edric's voice rumbled low as he unrolled a crude map across a plank of scavenged timber. Torvald tightens his patrols here, and here. See these roads? He knows we slip between the villages like water through a sieve, so he blocks the main tracks, hoping hunger or fear will drive us into his hands. Astrid leaned forward, one finger tracing a line through the hand-drawn trees. The old sheep trails. This run of dry ridge near the Vale, does it still hold? The smith's daughter nodded. Aye, no patrols brave the brambles there. Too narrow for horses, too tangled for wagons. Birgit spoke next, her voice quiet but iron-strong. My sister's kin in Arenhold keep the food hidden well enough, but grain alone won't feed the fires much longer. Folk need hope as much as bread. If they think betrayal will end this quicker, some might try. Astrid looked at her then, at the lines of worry carved deep around her eyes. Then we must make betrayal cost more than loyalty does. Not in coin, but in shame, in memory. Sir Edric raised his brow. And how do you bind shame into a man's heart when silver glitters before him? Astrid did not smile, but her gaze flared like an ember catching dry straw. With stories, old knight, stories sharper than any blade. We will leave signs, a mark upon a door where a traitor's whispers live, a sign in the fields to tell the folk who stands with us. They will see who feeds the black riders. They will see whose silence is bought. And when the Iron Hand's silver runs out, those men will find themselves alone, hungrier than they were before. A hush fell over the lodge, broken only by the hiss of rain and the pop of resin in the fire. Henrik's voice broke the silence, thin but fierce. And if they come for us? If Torvald finds where we hide? Astrid met his gaze. Then we vanish again, like mist on the river. He cannot fight what he cannot grasp. His iron breaks on stone, but water wears stone down to sand if it flows long enough. She looked into each of them, faces pale in the fire's glow, marked by fear and hope knotted so tightly they seemed the same thing. "We are not an army," she said. "We have no castle walls, but we have each other. That is how kingdoms fall, when the people inside them remember they were never meant to kneel forever." Outside, the wind rose in the branches, rattling the lodge like old bones. Edric folded the map and tucked it inside his cloak. One by one, they stood and gathered their few belongings: bundles of dried roots, a skin of watered ale, a sheaf of arrows tied with twine. They stepped into the rain without torches, their shadows melting into the wet hush of the forest. Astrid lingered last, hand resting briefly on the crumbling lintel. She listened to the wind, felt its cold breath on her brow. Somewhere beyond the dripping pines, Torvald's riders moved like wolves hunting a ghost. Let them come. Let them spread his silver like bait in the snow. She stepped into the dark, pulling her hood low. In the hush behind her, the fire sank to embers, whispering its promise to the damp stones, that iron would rust, that fear would crack, and that the Northmark's hush, once so heavy with dread, would one day ring with voices unafraid to speak each other's names. The rains gave way at last to a stretch of raw wind and fleeting sun, and with it the Northmark seemed to shake off its sodden cloak, if only for a breath. Patches of green showed timidly through the trampled fields where Torvald's patrols had passed, and birds returned to the hedgerows, their songs thin but stubborn. Yet the thaw did not soften the Iron Hand's rule. It only laid bare the scars winter had hidden. In the village of Grey Lane, perched on a low rise between two swollen brooks, the Iron Hand's bounty had begun its cruel work. Grey Lane had long been known for its stubborn folk, sheep herders and potters who minded their own and spoke little of the world beyond their pastures. But hunger had scraped even this stoic place raw. A rumor that Astrid herself had passed through Grey Lane's commons under cover of rain set tongues wagging and eyes darting. When Torvald's black riders arrived 3 days later, they found more than they'd hoped for, a handful of fearful men who swore they knew a cousin's cousin who'd glimpsed her beneath the old alder tree by the mill pond. By dusk, the riders had half the village penned within the crumbling walls of the churchyard. Torches guttered in the wind as Captain Rurik rode the line of captives, his black cloak slick with mud. The people did not meet his eyes. They watched the ground or the sky, anywhere but the glint of steel at his hip. "Bring forth the names," Rurik commanded, voice like iron striking flint. "Who gave her shelter? Who fed the ghost you call Astrid?" Silence answered him, heavy, sullen silence that smelled of wet wool and fear. He dismounted, boots sinking into the soft ground, and chose at random a stooped man with a potter's hands still stained with clay. With a single nod, 2 riders dragged the man to the ancient ash tree that crowned the yard. Rope creaked as it was thrown over a low limb, and when the noose tightened, the hush broke with muffled weeping. Birgit had warned them of this. From Eldreth to Grey Lane, the word had passed. When the Iron Hand could not find Astrid, he would turn the people against her, force confessions where none were needed, so wrought in the roots of hope. But Grey Lane did not break as easily as Torvald's court had counted on. For every man who flinched from the rope's shadow, 2 others closed their lips tighter still. They saw what was demanded of them: betray a girl they had not seen, for silver they would never hold, or stand silent and watch their neighbor swing. That night, when the riders pulled back to their tents beyond the village gate, the potter's widow slipped away under the cover of drifting clouds. She carried nothing but a lantern wrapped in a rag and a loaf of coarse oat bread she could not bring herself to eat. By the time dawn bled pale over Grey Lane's sodden roofs, she had found her way to the same charcoal pits where Henrik and Birgit's folk now laid their secret stores. Astrid was waiting there. No ghost, no holy maiden, but a girl who smelled of smoke and pine sap, who knelt in the wet moss to take the widow's trembling hands in her own. The bread she set aside at once. The lantern she accepted with a nod. But the widow's eyes were what she prized most, eyes that glistened not with coin's glint, but with the last hard gleam of dignity. Torvald's rope could not choke out. "He died with his eyes open," the widow said. "He never begged. He will not be forgotten," Astrid promised. She pressed her brow to the widow's, a gesture older than any crown, older even than the iron Torvald wore upon his hand. Go back to your hearth if you can. Speak no rash word. Grey Lane's hush will become its shield now. And so the quiet war grew another root, one that could not be tracked on any map or pinned beneath any blade. By day, Astrid's folk scattered back among the people. A mason's son in Eldrith, a shepherd girl in the upland pastures, a one-eyed midwife who passed hidden messages between cradles and graves. By night, they gathered like drifting snow, never twice in the same place. Beneath ruined mills, in hollow barns, at ancient barrows, the old folk said the spirits guarded. Sir Edric moved among them too, though the mud wore deep into the seams of his old mail and the cold bit his joints cruelly. He carried tales between firesides, of villages where Torvald's riders found only empty barns and barren cellars, of children slipping out at dawn with baskets of dried roots bound for hidden stores. He reminded each fearful heart that they were not alone, that the hush could hold more than fear. It could carry courage from one doorstep to the next. Back in Drakenhall, word of Grey Lane's silence reached Torvald's ears like a thorn in his boot. He called for his scribes, for new decrees, harder taxes, stricter watch, sharper punishment for any hint of rebellion. But each fresh cruelty landed like hammer blows on iron already cracked by frost. For every rope he strung, 10 voices whispered Astrid's name where the torchlight could not reach. And far from his stone keep, beneath a canopy of dripping pines, Astrid knelt at the edge of a cold stream, washing the last of the widow's tears from her palms. She looked at her reflection. A girl's face, yes, but with eyes darkened by more resolve than years. The forest behind her seemed to breathe as she did, carrying her promise outward like smoke from a hidden fire. She whispered to her own reflection then, not as a prayer, but as a vow. The rope shall break before we do, the hush shall hold before we fall. And when she rose, the first call of a lone owl stirred the sleeping trees, an echo that slipped between the branches, carrying her promise on to Grey Lane and beyond. In the restless weeks that followed Grey Lane's silent defiance, a change settled across the Northmark like a strange, defiant thaw. It did not come as banners rising or war drums echoing through the valleys. No clash of iron on iron, no great shout of freedom beneath castle walls. Instead, it crept in on the hush between dawn and dusk, in the steady rhythm of boots that did not march in ranks, but slipped through forests and field paths where Torvald's black riders dared not linger too long. It was in that hush that Astrid's people, no longer just frightened peasants, but something older, deeper, like the hidden roots of a great oak, learned to move as shadows moved. They did not meet in open fields, but in shepherds' folds, in the dark corners of old barns, in cellars walled off with false stones behind which whispers turned into quiet vows. Each village gave something, a sack of barley, a coil of rope, a name overheard by a drunk at the tavern door. And each village asked for nothing in return but a promise that their small defiance would live longer than fear. Torvald's bounty still glittered in the minds of the hungry, but for each man who considered betrayal, 2 more found ways to twist that silver into iron for Astrid's cause. Coins meant to buy informers turned up melted into arrowheads. Bribes meant to loosen tongues disappeared into the hidden coffers of woodsmen and charcoal burners who smuggled food and messages through the frostward's tangle. One such message now crossed the hills in the pocket of a boy no older than Henrik, a thin slip of parchment bound in a scrap of lambskin to keep it dry. He carried it tucked beneath his jerkin, pressed warm to his chest as he darted from thicket to stone wall, always watching the ridgelines for the glint of a black rider's helm. When he reached the forest edge, he paused beneath an ancient yew, bent double by centuries of storms. There, in the hush beneath its shadowed boughs, a figure stepped out, a woman in a cloak patched from so many bits of cloth it seemed half leaf, half homespun. She was older than Astrid, with hair plaited in a thick rope over one shoulder and eyes sharp enough to see the tremor in the boy's hands before he spoke. "Give it here, lad," she said, her voice the hush of wind through reeds. He fumbled the scrap free, and she slipped it into the hidden pocket of her sleeve. "Run home now. Keep to the hedgerows. If they stop you, you were gathering kindling." He nodded, breathless, then vanished like a hare into the underbrush. The woman, known to none but a handful by her true name, turned and melted deeper into the woods. The message she carried would reach Astrid by dusk, carried from hand to hand, hidden beneath shawls and baskets of wild herbs. When at last it came to Astrid, she sat beside a ring of low stones, half buried in moss, an old marker of the land's forgotten gods, its grooves worn smooth by centuries of rain. Sir Edric was with her, flanked by two of his most trusted scouts, their cloaks damp with the clinging mist that lingered even as the sun slipped toward its rest. Astrid read the slip once, then again, her lips moving silently as she traced the scrawl with a forefinger. She passed it to Edric without a word. He squinted in the waning light. "Harrow's Cross," he muttered. "So Torvald means to break us there." Harrow's Cross was no village but a crossroads. 4 muddy tracks that met beneath a weather-bent signpost, marking the line where Torvald's reach frayed into the deeper frostward wilds. Traders passed there in fairer times, driving carts laden with salted fish or peat for the lowland markets. Now it served as a choke point, a place where the black riders could tighten their grip and strangle the quiet flow of food and rumor that kept Astrid's folk alive. "They plan to cut off the hill folk from Eldrith and the Vial," Edric said, tapping the parchment with a blunt finger. "If they hold that ground, they'll split us like a branch at the fork." Astrid stared past him into the trees, where pale strands of mist curled between the trunks like ghost fire. "Then we must break them first," she said softly. Edric frowned. "You would risk an open skirmish?" "Not open," she said. "Never open. But a message must be sent. If they think the cross safe ground, they'll gather there like wolves about a carcass. We will remind them that this land is no carcass. It is alive, and it bites." One of the scouts, a slight girl with hair cropped close as a boy's, shifted her weight, her eyes alight with a hunger that had nothing to do with bread. "How many do we have near enough to muster by dawn?" "Not enough to stand in line," Edric said grimly, "but perhaps enough to vanish and strike." Astrid turned to the old knight, laying her hand on his wrist where the cold had stiffened the veins. "Then we strike as shadows strike. We know the bogs and bramble runs better than any armored horseman. We bleed them, take their mounts, their stores, their courage. We send them crawling back to Drakenhall with the cross and ashes behind them." A hush settled around the ring of stones then. No cry of battle, no roar of banners unfurled, only the steady breath of mist and the low sigh of the land itself. Edric nodded, his gray beard brushing the collar of his cloak. The scouts slipped away one by one, melting into the trees, their feet soft on the rain-slick leaves. Astrid rose last, standing within the ancient ring. Her eyes lifted to the canopy where the last light of day glimmered through drifting fog. Somewhere beyond the branches, the Iron Hand dreamed of silver and chains and the hush of broken villages bowing to his name. She turned from that thought as one turns from a dying fire, and with a wordless gesture to Edric, stepped into the dusk, carrying with her the promise that at Harrow's Cross, the hush would speak again, not with fear, but with the quiet, unstoppable voice of a people who had learned to move as the land itself moved, slow, patient, and impossible to catch. The night before the strike at Harrow's Cross arrived wrapped in a silence so deep it seemed the trees themselves were holding their breath. The crossroads lay beneath a vast, moonless sky, the old signpost leaning at its crooked angle where 4 muddy tracks met among bracken and thorn. Torvald's riders had come at dusk, 50 or more, their black cloaks heavy with road dust, their horses stamping restlessly at the unfamiliar scents of peat and bog water that drifted from the lowlands beyond. They made camp just north of the signpost, where the ground rose slightly to a hump of fir trees. They staked their horses in a tight ring, set watchfires that flickered like angry eyes in the dark, and spoke in low voices of what they would do when the girl was found. Some boasted of silver waiting in Drakenhall's vaults, enough to buy them new armor or land farther south where winters did not bite so deep. Others muttered darker things, of how the Iron Hand had grown restless, how his promises of reward were as cold and heavy as his threats. Captain Rurik himself sat apart near the largest fire, helm set beside him, sword across his knees. His eyes never strayed far from the darkness beyond the clearing, though he told himself it was only habit, only caution born of too many years spent breaking men who thought they could hide from the Iron Hand's will. But there was something in the hush tonight, something that made the hair at his nape stand on end no matter how close he leaned to the flames. He spat into the fire and watched it hiss. Let the ghosts come, he thought. He would gut them like any other rebel fool. But when his men's laughter faded into uneasy murmurs and the night pressed in close and cold, even Captain Rurik's iron certainty felt thin as the smoke rising toward the stars. Beyond the reach of torchlight, Astrid and her folk gathered in the low hollows where the bracken grew thick and the soft ground muffled footfalls. Sir Edric crouched beside her in the half-dark, the smell of damp earth and pine needles filling his lungs. Around them, a dozen shadows shifted, foresters with short bows, farmhands with billhooks wrapped in rags to dull their shine, 3 old charcoal burners who moved with the sure quiet of men used to slipping unseen between tree and stone. Astrid held no sword. At her belt hung only a knife, its handle worn smooth by years of carving traps and cutting snare lines. In her hand, she held a single length of flax cord, nothing more than a binding for a bundle of kindling, yet tonight it meant something else. A sign passed from hand to hand that when she gave the word, the hush would break its silence. Edric leaned close, his breath misting in the chill. If they press back hard, they won't find us to press, Astrid murmured. Her eyes, dark and bright, never left the faint glow of the riders' fires through the tree trunks. They think they are the storm, but they are only men who have forgotten the dark is older than their torches. She lifted the cord. A single tug, nothing more, and it passed down the line, from the girl with the cropped hair to the smith's daughter with her iron hammer wrapped in linen, to Henrik's brother, now old enough to bear a bough across his shoulder. No horn, no shout, just the hush moving, soft as the sigh of the wind through the bracken. The first arrow fell without a sound, striking the edge of the fire where Rurik sat. Sparks hissed and leapt. He started up, barking in order, but the second shaft found the oilskin bundle they'd piled too close to the flames, a stash of lamp oil meant for their own lanterns. It caught at once, flaring into a gout of fire that sent men stumbling back, blinded by sudden light. From the shadows, Astrid's folk moved, not in a charge, no clash of shields, no roar of banners, but in quick cuts and sudden strikes. A rope cut here sent 3 horses bolting into the dark, their hooves drumming panic through the camp. A kick of boot and the supply cart toppled, spilling salt pork and dried peas into the mud. A single sharp whistle, like an owl's call, and a pair of torches vanished into the bog pools, their bearers dragged under by the quick suck of the marshy ground. Panic did what blades could not. The riders, so sure of their circle of steel, turned inward first, shouting, swearing, striking at shadows that slipped between trees like breath. One man, confused by the swirl of firelight and flying embers, brought his axe down on the wrong back. Another fled the ring of flame, only to find himself chest-deep in a mire hole he could not climb free of. Captain Rurik fought to rally them, his voice a raw snarl above the crackle of burning oil and the whinnies of spooked horses. He caught sight of Astrid only once, half glimpsed at the tree line, her hair wild in the fire's reflection, her eyes cold and still as the frost. He lunged toward her, but Edric's hand found his shoulder first. The old knight's battered mail gleamed dully as he slammed his pommel into Rurik's helm, sending him sprawling face first into the trampled mud. They could have killed him then. But Astrid only shook her head once when Edric lifted his blade. Instead, they melted back into the trees as quickly as they'd come, shadows slipping through bracken and bog like rain through a sieve. Behind them, the crossroads burned. Not the land, but the riders' own wagons, their stores, their illusions of safety. By dawn, Harrow's Cross was nothing but drifting smoke and scattered hoofprints in the churned mud. Rurik's battered men limped back toward Drakenhall, carrying with them the taste of a fight they could not grasp. A war waged not with banners, but with the hush itself, turning every tree, every shadow, every trembling voice into part of a weapon they could neither catch nor kill. And deep in the woods, where the mist rose in pale curls through the underbrush, Astrid stood beside Sir Edric and the boy who'd carried the message that made this night possible. She touched his shoulder lightly, her fingers cold but steady. Let them fear the dark. she said to the hush that carried her words away among the sleeping pines. Let them fear what they cannot see, and remember that it is ours. In Drakenhall, the Iron Hand would wake to news of Harrow's cross, a name that would carry more than defeat. It would carry a promise that the hush he had tried so long to silence now spoke louder than any crown's decree. Far from the flickering hearts of humble peasants and the solemn bells of monasteries, the terrible kings of old left behind legacies of ruin that whispered through the corridors of centuries. As the tale drifts now into its 19th passage, let us wander to the frost-bitten edges of a kingdom where cruelty took the form not of reckless rage, but of deliberate coldness. A ruler whose heart seemed carved of winter stone, unyielding and remote. His name was King Athelmar of the Northern Reach, a monarch whose crown gleamed brighter than any star above his snow-swept realm, and yet whose people knew warmth only in secret prayers behind shuttered doors. Athelmar had ascended the throne not by birthright alone, but by erasing every other claim with the chill efficiency of a glacier grinding rock to dust. His father, King Osric, had been a warlord of rough but simple cruelties, preferring the clang of swords to the hush of poisoned goblets. But Athelmar was different. His court was a place of silence, where words held more threat than spears. Servants glided through the great hall like ghosts, afraid to let their footsteps echo lest they be summoned for some obscure offense. It was said that Athelmar's eyes could pierce through the thickest lie, and that his voice, soft as drifting snow, carried a weight that bent men's spines to breaking. It was in his 3rd year upon the throne that the winter storms came early. By late harvest, the first flakes had begun to swirl across the high passes, cutting off villages one by one. The peasants, thin and hollow-eyed, waited for relief from the royal stores. They prayed that the king would open his granaries, for the frost bit deeper each week. Yet when envoys reached the stone gates of Athelmar's fortress, they were turned away with polite words and iron spears. The king, it was said, believed hardship made strong men. Only the strong, he whispered to his closest circle, deserved to survive the Reach's endless winter. Word spread through the forests and frozen plains of mothers pressing their children to their breasts to share what little warmth they had left, of old men digging roots beneath snowdrifts while wolves watched from the pines. And still, Athelmar sat upon his throne of black oak, the fire in his hall crackling while his people shivered. Within the walls, feasts were held for loyal nobles, goblets brimming with mulled wine, boar roasted on spits while the wind outside wailed like an orphan. To dine at his table was to taste guilt with every mouthful, for each bite was stolen from the mouths of a starving child far below the icy crags. One night, a figure arrived at court, an old woman wrapped in rags that smelled of hearth smoke and pine resin. She claimed to be a seer from the far eastern forests, where the spirits of the ancient world still lingered among twisted birches. She knelt at the foot of Athelmar's dais, her breath misting in the cold hall. "Great king," she rasped, "the snow listens when men speak of cruelty. Even the ice will turn against you if you feed it with your people's bones." Athelmar's counselors laughed softly behind gloved hands, but the king only inclined his head. "Tell me, grandmother," he said, voice smooth as frozen rivers, "will the spirits send warmth if I bow to beggars? Or shall I stand tall and let the weak feed the strong?" The old woman's eyes, pale as hoarfrost, did not flinch. "The weak you scorn are the blood in your veins. Starve them, and you starve yourself. The storm you think you command will bury you in your pride." For a moment, silence held the great hall captive. Then Athelmar gestured to his guards, who led the seer away into the darkness. It is said she vanished that very night, her rags found drifting along the castle's ramparts like shed snakeskin. Some whispered she had returned to the forests, others that she had melted into the snow, her warnings now carried by the wind. Winter deepened. The rivers froze so solid that carts could pass over them as if on stone. Wolves grew bolder, slinking down from the hills to prowl near barn doors and village squares. The people, too hungry to resist, watched with hollow eyes as livestock were taken in the night. Rumors flickered like candle flames in the dark, of parents giving up their own warmth so that the youngest might see spring, of entire hamlets vanished beneath drifts taller than a man's shoulders. Still, Athelmar's court glittered in unnatural brilliance. Musicians played soft airs on lutes strung with gut, their fingers stiffening in the cold drafts that even the palace braziers could not fully chase away. Servants laid new rushes daily, covering stains no one spoke of, blood from a guard punished for speaking out of turn, or from a cook who dared to slip bread to a beggar child at the gate. And yet, beneath this frozen tyranny, a stirring took root. Small, fragile acts of rebellion, villagers sharing hidden stores, monks sending secret caravans of grain, hunters guiding the desperate through hidden passes to warmer valleys. Each whisper of defiance drifted like a snowflake into Athelmar's dreams, unsettling his nights. He began to wake at dawn, pacing his chambers in silence, staring into the hearth as if he could command it to burn hotter, to melt away the rising shadow of his people's anger. The nobles, too fat on their borrowed comfort, did not see it coming. They drank their wine and clapped politely when minstrels sang of Athelmar's strength. But among them moved men and women who remembered warmer days, young squires whose mothers had died that winter, widowed ladies whose tenants now lay beneath icy mounds. They watched their king with eyes that held the quiet promise of reckoning. When the snows at last began to soften their grip, when the first drip of meltwater carved tiny rivers down the mountain roads, the people of the northern reach stirred from their icy graves. They gathered in secret, wrapped in cloaks patched so many times they were more thread than cloth. They spoke not of vengeance, but of life, of fires rekindled, fields replanted, children fed without fear. Yet in his high fortress, King Athelmar felt none of this thaw. His heart, bound in iron frost, knew only that something had begun to slip beyond his grasp. At the banquet table, he would pause mid-feast, eyes fixed on the shadows that danced upon the walls, as if expecting them to step forward and whisper his doom. His counselors tried to soothe him with flatteries, but beneath the silk words he heard the winds mutter, an echo of the old seer's warning, carried from the forests to his door. Outside, the first brave buds of spring pushed through the last crust of snow, but inside the walls of stone and fear, winter still ruled. And within that chill, the seeds of the king's downfall waited, patient as frost in the deepest well. As the reach stirred beneath the tentative kiss of spring, King Athelmar's fortress remained a bastion of unyielding frost. Its towers rose like black spears against the pale dawn, windows shuttered tight to keep the warmth within and the world without. Yet warmth, like loyalty, is not so easily contained, and within those walls, the king's cold rain began to fracture, hairline cracks creeping through the marble floors and gilded tapestries. It began with whispers, servants exchanging glances in shadowed corridors, stable boys passing folded scraps of parchment beneath piles of straw. Even the royal guard, once loyal to the gleaming coin and the promise of feasts, felt their resolve slip like ice beneath booted feet. For they, too, had families beyond the gates, mothers with empty larders, sisters bartering trinkets for sacks of grain, fathers bent double beneath the weight of a winter that seemed to stretch on forever. Athelmar felt this subtle shift like a draft under a locked door. He tightened his circle, dismissing long-trusted stewards for imagined treasons, replacing captains with foreign mercenaries whose loyalty could be bought, at least until the silver ran dry. He ordered new measures of control, edicts forbidding gatherings after dusk, taxes levied on those who dared hoard food against his will, threats carved into the village squares in the form of bodies hung from stout beams, stark warnings against defiance. Yet outside his walls, life proved stubborn as weed among flagstones. The thawing roads became hidden veins of rebellion. Pilgrims, traders, wandering minstrels, none arrived without pockets full of news and secrets. They carried tales of Athelmar's hoarded feasts and the old seer's vanished warning. They spoke of children's bones buried shallow beneath snowdrifts, of mothers who spat curses into their hearth fires when the king's name was spoken. In the village of Frostmere, closest to the fortress's shadow, a boy named Eldred rose from such grief. Barely 15 winters old, yet his eyes were those of a man twice his age, hollowed by hunger, sharpened by loss. His father, a woodsman, had died when the king's men seized their meager stores for tribute. His mother faded soon after, warmth gone from her limbs like a candle guttered by a draft. Eldred survived on bark broth and the mercy of neighbors who had little to spare. When the first true thaw turned snow to mud, Ealdred crept into the dark pine forests where rumor said the hidden ones gathered. Old hunters, monks turned rebels, peasants who would not bend the knee again. There, around campfires hidden beneath evergreen boughs, he listened. He learned that the strength of the North did not lie in Athelmar's iron crown, but in the hands of those who tilled its stubborn soil, in the axes that felled its trees, in the silent pack that hunger would not have them again. Within the fortress, Athelmar's dreams soured into nightmares. Each night he saw pale faces pressed to frosted glass, mouths moving in silence, eyes wide with the accusations of the starved. He paced before the great hearth, yet even its flames brought no comfort. He summoned priests to read prayers, seers to speak of omens. None could soften the weight upon his chest. One evening he ordered a grand feast, a show of power to still the tremors beneath his feet. Nobles from across the reach came clad in furs and silks, their carriages rolling over thawed roads muddied by the spring melt. The great hall was filled with the scents of roasted meats and spiced wines, the hush of strings plucked by shivering musicians who dared not falter. At the head of the table, Athelmar sat, his crown gleaming in the firelight, his smile sharp as frostbite. But as goblets rose and laughter echoed off cold stones, a sound beneath it all grew louder, the steady drip of melting snow, like a heartbeat too faint to ignore. Servants slipped among the tables with wary eyes, carrying trays piled high with steaming bread and dripping meat, even as they thought of their kin beyond the gates with empty bowls. Some servants spat into the king's wine when no one watched. Some slipped scraps into hidden pockets, their rebellion no less fierce for its silence. Outside, beneath the windows where torchlight spilled in wavering pools, Ealdred crept with a handful of others, gaunt shadows against the stone. They moved from postern gate to cellar door, whispering promises to guards whose coin had lost its shine. Inside the hall, Athelmar laughed, a brittle sound that cut through the revelry like an icicle snapping from an eave. He lifted his goblet high, toasting to the strength of his rule, blind to the frayed edge unraveling beneath his throne. By dawn, the first betrayal would slip like a knife between the fortress's ribs. A guard, half-starved and hollow-eyed, left a gate unbarred. A cook spilled secrets to those waiting in the dark. The fortress, built to keep winter at bay, could not hold back the thawing will of the people. And in that creeping melt, Ealdred and his hidden kin prepared not for revenge alone, but for the warmth of fires relit in hearths long cold. The people spoke of spring now in hushed prayers, not merely as a season, but as a reckoning, a soft but certain force that even Athelmar's iron heart could not command. And while he sat high above, draped in stolen furs and the brittle certainty of his own power, the quiet rebellion gathered at his feet like meltwater seeping through stone, a promise that this final frost would not hold forever. In the hush of dawn, as ravens circled the fortress towers, the people of the Reach dreamed not of crowns and spears, but of bread warm from the oven, fields greening beneath gentle sun, and a king's voice silenced at last by the rising chorus of a land that refused to be buried in snow ever again. Dawn broke pale and reluctant over the fortress of Athelmar, the first rays of spring light spilling across ramparts still rimmed with frost. Yet beneath that chill veneer, warmth stirred in hidden places. The night's conspiracies, whispered along icy corridors and through the hush of stables, had set in motion a reckoning long postponed. As the king slept, cloaked in restless dreams of snow and shadows, his people moved closer, step by silent step, to the heart of his frozen dominion. In the village of Frostmere, the young boy Eldred stood at the edge of the pine woods, where the thawing earth released the smell of damp moss and old needles. Beside him crouched Geetha the widow, her back bent not by age alone, but by winters of grief. Oswin the hunter, who had guided caravans through secret passes when the roads were choked with drifts, and half a dozen others, faces drawn but eyes alight with a fire no king's edict could snuff. They were no army, just peasants with axes dulled by wood, pitchforks stolen from fields yet thaw, and blades rusted by too many seasons hidden beneath floorboards. Yet in their hunger, there lay a purpose sharper than steel. Above them, the fortress loomed, a crown of stone and shadow against the pale sky. From cracks in its walls, faint tendrils of smoke curled into the windless dawn, carrying the scent of last night's feast. Roast boar, honeyed bread, wine sweeter than the frost that clung to the ramparts. Ealdred clenched his jaw against the growl in his belly. He thought of his mother's hands, raw from scraping lichen from stones, and of his father's grave beneath a cairn that the wolves sometimes sniffed around in the dark. Behind him, Oswin laid a rough hand on the boy's shoulder. "There's no turning now, lad. You lead us through the gate, or we scatter like chaff." Ealdred nodded, though his heart thundered so loud he thought the guards on the wall might hear. He clutched the iron key given to him by a guard, an old man whose son had starved before the thaw. That son's ghost seemed to stand beside him now, urging him forward. Inside the fortress walls, life wore its mask of cold splendor. In the great hall, the fires had burned low. Nobles lay in their chambers, sated from wine and spiced meats, unaware that their laughter would echo no more by dusk. Servants moved through shadowed passages, some wide-eyed with fear, some stiff with resolve. Rumor traveled like wildfire. The hidden ones were coming. The king's men muttered among themselves, yet the weight of silver could not still the unease that crept into their bones. Athelmar himself, cocooned in furs and dreams, woke just as the sun broke free of the horizon. He sat up in his great bed, the silence of his chamber deeper than ever. He dreamed he heard the old seer's voice again, warning him that the snow would turn, that the cold he had wielded like a blade would one day cut him down. He shook off the vision with a snarl and rang a bell for his steward. No answer came. He rose, pulling his robe tight around his shoulders. His breath misted in the cold air, a ghost of warmth soon gone. Crossing to the high window, he peered down into the courtyard below. There, by the postern gate, he saw movement. Shapes where none should be. Too many shapes. A tremor flickered through him then, so slight it might have been the draft. But in his mind, a seed of doubt cracked open. He turned from the window, calling for guards whose footsteps did not come. At the gate, Eldred's hands shook as he fit the iron key into the frozen lock. Geetha muttered a prayer beneath her breath, words old as the pines. With a soft click, the lock gave way. The gate swung inward on stiff hinges, a breath of warm air spilling out to kiss their chilled faces. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then they stepped inside. Within the walls, silence shivered. Ealdred led them past the kennels where the king's hounds lay dead or dying, starved for weeks, for even beasts were rivals for scraps. They crossed the stable yard where frost rimed the horses' manes. Every step deeper into the fortress felt like sinking into the heart of winter itself. But the warmth ahead pulled them onward, toward kitchens, storerooms, pantries bursting with hoarded grain and salted meat. They split without words. Geetha and Oswin herded the servants to their side, promising freedom from the king's cold rule. Casks of wine were rolled from cellars, sacks of flour slung over shoulders. A quiet cheer rose among them, hushed but fierce, a warmth that cracked the fortress's icy hold. Athelmar, alone in his chambers, heard the distant stir. He dressed with trembling hands, donning his crown as if its weight might hold back the flood. He barked orders at empty doorways. He called for his council, but they had fled or hidden themselves like rats when the cellar floods. He stumbled through passageways lined with frozen banners, the chill of the stones seeping into his bones. In the courtyard, peasants and servants alike tore open the granaries. Children who had not tasted full bellies in months sank to their knees beside overflowing sacks of oats and wept as they ate handfuls raw. It was not a siege. It was an unmaking, a frost melting not by sword, but by hunger and courage and the simple refusal to kneel. Eldred stood amid it all, mud and thawed snow clinging to his boots. He felt smaller than the walls around him, yet taller than he had ever felt in his 15 short years. He saw the people lifting food to one another's mouths, old men laughing through tears, mothers pressing warm bread to their children's lips. For a moment, the fortress felt less like a tomb and more like a hearth long denied its flame. But Athelmar, that last stubborn relic of winter, still clung to his crown. Word spread through the courtyard that the king was seeking loyal men, promising gold and titles, whispering threats into the ears of mercenaries. Some listened. Fear is a hard chain to break. But others turned away. For what is a crown worth when the people no longer bow? By dusk, the walls that had once caged the north's warmth would stand open to the wind and sun. The people would pour out of the gates, their pockets filled with what had been stolen from them. And at the center of it all, alone at last, Athelmar would stand in his cold hall, the embers in the hearth dying, his crown glinting dully in the gathering dark. Night settled over the northern reach with a softness that belied the storm it sheltered within. The fortress, once a monolith of iron will and frost-bound silence, now hummed with voices, a low murmur of feet in passageways, of children's laughter echoing in stone courtyards that had known only the scrape of armored boots. Torches flickered in doorways long shuttered, and the scent of baking bread, stolen from royal stores, drifted through halls that had reeked of cold meat and fear. Athelmar sat alone in the great hall where, not 2 nights past, he had feasted beneath banners stitched with his sigil, a black wolf upon white snow. Now those banners sagged in the draught. One had fallen into the ashes of the hearth, its threads curling and blackening among dying coals. The king's crown, heavy with iron and set with stones cold as his rule, rested beside his goblet on the long oak table. He did not wear it now. What use is a crown when its weight no longer bends men's backs? He stared at the door that led to the courtyard, hearing beyond it the distant murmur of people rediscovering warmth. Once, he would have commanded silence with a whisper. Now his voice fell back to him, unanswered, like snowflakes drifting into a void. In a far corner of the hall, a boy stood, Ealdred, his thin shoulders straight despite the exhaustion pinching his eyes. Mud crusted his boots. The edge of a borrowed dagger glinted at his side. He did not flinch beneath the king's stare. He had come not with an army, not with fire or iron siege, but with the simplest, most devastating rebellion, the will of the hungry to be hungry no longer. Athelmar raised a hand, skeletal fingers pale against the tarnished oak. "You come to kill me, boy?" His voice cracked like ice splitting on a thawing lake. Eldred shook his head. "You're already dead," he said, and the softness of it struck deeper than any blade. The king's lips twitched, something like a smile ghosting across the ruin of his pride. "So they will bury me as a ghost, then?" He looked around his hall, at the long tables scraped bare of silver platters, at the embers guttering in hearths he had once commanded to blaze brighter than the sun. He thought of the old seer, her voice drifting through the crackle of burning logs. "Even the ice will turn against you if you feed it with your people's bones." Beyond the hall, the people had begun to sing. A rough, halting chorus carried on voices unaccustomed to music that did not praise a crown. Old harvest songs, lullabies once whispered over cradle boards, hymns to warmth and earth and green things pushing stubborn through frost. The sound bled through the fortress walls, soft but relentless, weaving among the stones Athelmar had thought so strong. "You have your bread," he rasped, voice raw. "You have your warmth. Take it all and leave me my crown." Eldred stepped forward, the dagger hanging at his side but not lifted. He looked at the crown where it lay beside the goblet, dull iron catching torchlight like a dying star. "Your crown bought our hunger," he said. "It cannot buy our silence." Athelmar's hand twitched toward the crown, then fell away. In the hush, the crackle of the hearth sounded like laughter. A wind slipped through a gap in the shutters, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. Spring's breath, soft yet insistent. The king shivered in his heavy furs, yet felt no warmth. Ealdred turned without further word. He walked back through the hall, past pillars that had borne witness to generations of kings who thought themselves winter-made flesh. Behind him, the king did not rise. He did not call the boy back, nor summon the guards who no longer stood watch at the doors. He listened instead to the people's song, a thin, ragged thread weaving the warmth of many voices together, a warmth he could never command. Outside, the gates of the fortress swung wide. Peasants, freed from their fear, poured out into the muddy roads, bearing sacks of grain, casks of salted fish, wheels of cheese, hoarded for feasts they would never again serve to men who dined while they starved. They moved like a river released from its frozen bed, flowing down to villages hollowed by frost, to hearths where ashes waited to be kindled anew. In Frostmere, fires flickered back to life. Mothers stirred stews rich with meat and root. Old men set seeds in thawing soil. Children laughed as they tasted warmth on their tongues. No banners flew, but the smoke of cooking fires curling into the clear spring sky. No crown weighed upon their bowed heads. only the hush of a hard winter loosening its grip. Within the fortress, Athelmar sat unmoving, the crown untouched beside his hand. The cold he had wielded so faithfully seeped into his bones now, not as power but as penance. For in the end, even a king who built his throne from ice must learn what comes when spring refuses to bow. And so the Reach remembered. They did not carve his name on stone, nor sing of him in halls or fields. They spoke instead of how warmth returned, when the last terrible king was left alone with his crown, while the people carried the fire back to their hearths, and the snow at last was forced to melt.